This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority.
And a welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. My name is Sakina Sheikh. I'll be chairing this committee for the last time of the term, actually. This will be the last Planning and Regeneration Committee of this 2021 GLA term, and it's been a really fantastic and productive term, I think, in terms of what the Planning and Regeneration Committee have been able to achieve. So I'll probably do my thanks properly at the end of this meeting, but just before I even begin, I will say a big thank you to the committee members. I've had the pleasure of chairing it for the last 2 years, and it's been a very productive, collaborative, cross-party sort of effort, I think, from the committee members. We've achieved a lot, particularly last year, looking at planning reforms, taking our amendments to the House of Lords, and also releasing a report on carbon emissions in the built environment. So I am absolutely going to miss this environment, and like I said, a big thank you to everyone who's been so forthcoming with cross-party collaboration to make sure that we can think about how we improve the built environment in London for all Londoners. Now, members of the public tuned in may like to follow us on Twitter, or X as it's now called, at London Assembly, and we use the hashtag for this committee meeting, hashtag Assembly Planning. Please may I remind everyone to switch their phones to silent mode, and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. I would also like to, at some point, but not now because there's no one in the audience, extend a warm welcome to the Urban Regeneration Master's students from the University of College, who will apparently be joining at some point to listen to today's meeting. So if we don't get a chance to welcome them then, welcome in advance to them. Now, today we are holding an investigation on gender-informed planning. I think this is something that the committee's been quite excited about, and we're really excited that we've got an all-women panel to talk us through this, I think, increasingly emerging and interesting way of thinking about how we design. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I ask the committee officer to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies for absence from Assembly Member Fortune.
Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask members if they have any interest to declare? Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting held on the 30th of January 2024? Great. Thank you. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the committee's previous meetings? Great. Can we note the action taken by me, the chair of the committee, under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members to agree the committee's report, Retrofit and Rebuild? Yeah, and as usual, I'm going to go off script and just say, we had a launch on the 7th of February for this report, and it was so well attended. We had a packed audience here at City Hall, and it's really great to be able to welcome Londoners into this sort of, it doesn't feel so new anymore, but the sort of newish City Hall building, and show that the London Assembly really does work in the interest of, convening important stakeholders across London to help, direct and support emerging thinking in all areas of our governance. So again, a big thank you to the committee members, but particularly the Secretariat, who made that launch so successful. Now, we move on to our main item of business, a discussion on gender-informed planning, as I've mentioned. Apologies in advance if I butcher anyone's surname, and I would actually encourage you to switch your microphone on and correct me, or when you are about to speak, maybe just introduce yourself then. But today we have, if I'm not mistaken, Alison Bradshaw, the Spatial Planning Area Team Manager at Transport for London. Welcome, Alison. Sarah Considine, brilliant, Principal Project Officer in Good Growth by Design Unit at the Greater London Authority. Fantastic. Olivia Theocarides.
Theocarides, but
Theocarides.
Close, very close.
Theocarides, thank you. Olivia Theocarides. And a big thank you, Olivia. I know you stepped in last minute in replacement of Julia. And I have here you're the founding associate at JK&A Associates. Fantastic. Susannah Walker, fantastic, you've made it. You're the co-founder and trustee of Make Space for Girls. We were expecting you a little later, but thank you so much for rushing in.
The trains almost worked.
Almost worked, great. Well, I'm so pleased it meant that you were able to get here. Welcome. Teo Issa Daniel?
Yep.
Brilliant. Urban researcher, architect, and senior design researcher at Atkin Realis. Brilliant. And then Marina Milosev. How did I butcher that?
Milosev, but it's impossible to know that from,
Marina
from the letters in my surname.
Thank you. And Marina is the team leader at the London Legacy Development Corporations. Right, a big and warm welcome to you all. Let me actually pull out the relevant papers that I seem to have just put away in my bag. Now, we're going to obviously have a series of questions. Generally, the committee will direct specific questions at those that we think are best placed to answer them. If others do want to come in, obviously, please do indicate. But we've got a lot of questions to get through, and there will be ample opportunity at any point if you feel like you haven't said what you've come to offer as evidence, that you will have a chance to reflect to that. But I'll probably start off with an open question to all, but maybe Olivia, leading with you. What specific barriers or biases do women face in the built environment?
That's a very broad question. I think there's a lot of biases and barriers. I think what I can speak to most is probably the experience of individuals who identify as girls and young women, particularly, rather than older women. A lot of the research that I've done previously, I was a researcher at the LSE, and the research that I have done focuses on that age bracket of 16 to 25. And for us, some of those biases that we found through our research was that a lot of women experience high degrees of judgment in public space, and that's impacted by design, but also obviously by planning and policy and other experiences of misogyny that women have in public space. But I think that judgment is really one of those topics that are up there. And of course, safety. Safety does limit how women move around their local areas. And I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in with. Oh, yeah.
I'll definitely be opening up to the panel, but can you just elaborate a little bit what you mean by judgment?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, judgment, I guess, this feeling of being out of place. And there's a great geographer that actually talks about this and talks about how young women often feel in the wrong body, in the wrong place, or in the wrong gender, in the wrong place, and in the wrong age. And that young women often have this experience, like they're excluded from public space because young people tend to be stigmatized or thought of as, like, being kind of this emblem of antisocial behavior, and young women are not exempt from that assumption. Young women also feel like they're being sexualized or looked at in ways that aren't necessarily the type of attention that they'd want to attract. Young women tend to move around in groups as well. Like, young women like to hang out in groups in parks, for example. They like to be with other peers for safety, but also just that's the way that a lot of young women socialize. And they often feel stigmatized for that. So they feel that people are judging them when they want to try and use a playground, for example. They're too old, and they feel judged by parents. And if they want to use adult spaces, they often also feel judged by older members of the community.
Thank you. That's really interesting, actually, because often we think about safety in a sort of very sort of criminal lens, or through the lens of crime, on a very sort of physical level. But actually, judgment, I think, taps into sort of like the more like the psychological and mental well-being of people as they sort of navigate the built environment, and particularly young women, as you've identified. Thank you. Did anyone else want to come in on the question of what specific barriers or biases do women face in the built environment? Susannah.
I'll have a go. Yes, what Olivia just said, we find a lot is, and I think there's a key aspect of that sometimes I think we need to say out loud, which is sexual harassment, which particularly for young women, which again is mostly what we deal with at Make Space for Girls, is a huge part of their life. Teenage girls get more sexual harassment than women. Women get sexually harassed everywhere. It's not... And even when you're not even in the wrong place, in the wrong time, in the wrong clothes. I saw an amazing amazing and disappointing piece of research a couple of weeks ago, where it showed that the teenage girls and young women get the most sexual harassment between 4 and 6 p.m. So on the way back from school. It's that that judgment and that sense of constantly being scrutinised is a really key part of safety. I think the main barrier is just that we don't look at things through a gender lens. Simply that.
Thank you very much. Marina.
Yeah, absolutely. So safety and perception of safety is one of the biggest barrier. I think when we're talking about safety, we also need to be very I guess, conscious and mindful, and it's a very sensitive topic, and particularly when we're putting safety in the context of urban design and planning, it is something that we really need to be careful, because the statistical data is actually showing us that it is more the perception of safety that is the key barrier. Now, obviously, this is not to minimize that there are instances of sexual harassment in particular, but also when we're talking about the safety and crime, that would be with the lens of really focusing on sexual harassment, because the safety is more likely that men would be victim of crime in public spaces, but overwhelmingly and almost exclusively women are victims of sexual harassment. And it is that fear that is preventing women from using public spaces. Now, the result of that is huge. It impacts women and girls' access to employment. So we need to be thinking beyond just keeping safe, but thinking about what opportunities women and girls are missing because of the fear of the safety. Another things that we were focusing doing the research over the past 3 years in LLDCs, shifting the focus from just safety and perception of safety. That is very important, but we also want to start thinking about this complex topic more from the perspective of empowering women and girls to be and occupy spaces. To their right to the city is also very important, rather than just looking at as the victims. And within there, we found that, for example, how we our land uses, distribution of land uses, does not respond to the needs of women and girls. Infrastructure is often inadequate. And I would say something that is pretty symbolic but very important. In the world, only 2 to 3% of all of the statues are statues of named women and girls. And to me, apart from safety, which is the most important issue because it is fundamental, there is something about the message that we are not supposed, that we're not almost cherished through the, in our cities. So it's really symbolic as well to me. And it's that constant message when you're in public spaces, whether you really should be there. And it's a complex topic, so there is a lot of things. But yeah, in terms of barrier, apart from safety, land uses, infrastructure, the way how we design public spaces, whether there are facilities to support women throughout the day, is something that is also a barrier and an issue. And the main issue actually comes from the fact that we don't have the data-driven evidence to actually show the multifaceted problem.
I think that's really helpful, and I think especially that last point you touched on about data-driven sort of evidence. If it sounds like we're still sort of asking the key questions to be able to even understand what the data collection needs to be. So I think it'd be really fantastic to begin to continue teasing out what those key questions are and think about from the GLA's perspective what we can do to support and enable that data collection. I don't know if, yes, please, Theo.
Yeah, I just find myself kind of agreeing with everyone here at the table. I think voices to really sort of listen and to engage with young women is really important, especially when you are working on city plans, master plans. There's always that bit of engagement, but it feels like a ticking box exercise. It feels quite tokenistic sometimes when when sort of you engage with communities but don't really listen, and also kind of go sort of before the design process to listen to what women want, and then also after the design process just to see kind of where the gaps are, because I think that's where we're missing a lot of information on what works versus what doesn't work. I think also in terms of safety, yes, there is sort of that perceived bit of safety. I think there's parts that you can quantify. For example, how much lighting is on the street? Is there, how busy is that street? Is there sort of some sort of a economy that runs 24 hours? I find myself sometimes, when I'm walking back home, seeing a McDonald's, for example, is a really sort of good sign that, okay, there's someone at least in that shop. But I think as women in general, we're very much aware of these kind of points that we find along our journeys. I think also the end-to-end journey from stations all the way home can be quite scary when you are traveling at night. And we do find, I think when working with Susannah and Olivia as well, we did find sort of when doing sort of exercises around trip chains that kind of that maps kind of a geography of places that you avoid as a woman. So.
Thank you, Theo. Susannah, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something specific about data, because it's something that, yes, I completely agree, I'm really passionate about. We have almost no data on women's safety, on, for example, in the area we specialise in, teenage girls and space. We literally know nothing about how teenagers use space. We know almost nothing about all the stuff we build all the time. People build Mugas, build skate parks, and then, as Theo says, there's no post-occupancy evaluation. So we have no idea what's actually working, or just who is using space at the most basic level. But yeah, post-occupancy stuff really, really, really important, and needs to get written into planning guidance, because otherwise we can't identify what's working. You know, we're doing all these initiatives and we don't know what's working. Final point, one of the things that comes up most often in safety work is lighting, which is only a partial solution, but crucially we don't know what safer lighting for women and girls looks like. We know a lot about what lighting for bats looks like. So possibly we could produce some guidance like the bats have.
So, thank you for that. I've got Olivia and then Alison, just in the order that has been indicated.
I think it's also really important when we're all talking about safety, and I think the GLA actually does that really well, to have this quite expansive definition of safety, so that safety does encompass things like harassment, but it also does encompass what Tayo was talking about, for example, like being inconvenienced. So in our research, we found that, you know, a lot of young women were getting off the bus a stop early or taking a longer bus so that they weren't dropped off in an area where they felt like that would be unsafe. And initially, they said, you know, no, I feel safe taking the bus. But then that sense of safety impacted, you know, whether they felt safe or not on one bus or another actually impacted that they feel safe because they take the bus journey that feels safe. But there is a decision based on safety there that is about, that ends up being inconvenienced. And I think, yeah, maybe you want to talk about that?
No, I think it's interesting because I think actually it's become second nature a lot of the time, so we don't even necessarily like consciously process that that's something that's just inbuilt in the way that we think, as a consequence of the the environment, rather than taking a step back and saying, actually, if I didn't have to think about that, what would my journey look like? What would it feel like? So thank you for that point. Alison.
I just wanted to, we've mentioned data, and I just want to point out we're going to talk a lot about data and the lack of data, but I just want to say how difficult it is, and collecting data, particularly on this topic, which is so triggering. You know, how we do this, we could make these statements, we don't have data, we need to collect data, but actually, what does that mean? How are we treating women and girls? And when we collect that data, how we follow that through. TfL are currently doing women's safety audits, where we're looking at how we engage with women, just not even the questions, like the process of that, and when, you know, how to get the right women, paying for things like childcare and all things like, you know, it is so triggering for a lot of people. As soon as this conversation starts being brought up, it's really difficult. So I just wanted to put that out there about the collection of data. We're doing another big research. I know it was mentioned at the last committee, over 1,000 women are talking to TfL about how they feel about safety in transport in London. But it's just very, very difficult. I just want to put that as a right at the start of this discussion.
No, I think that's really helpful. I think very early on we've identified like quite a core aspect of what's required to be effective in creating policy that might shift this conversation in the right direction. And I think we'll certainly come on, and I know some of my members have questions specifically around transport, but we'd be really interested to hear how that data collection is going with those 1,000 women. Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting and broad question, and not something that's easy to sum up, and I agree with everything that's been said on the panel so far, but I guess it's really, to my mind, in a nutshell, it's about the kind of processes of design, development, urban policies, and whether they do or don't take into account the kind of specific needs and barriers of women. Olivia talked a bit about the way that we have defined safety through the work that we've been developing through the Good Growth by Design programme, and I think that's really helpful. And it's essentially around the idea that safety is experienced as a spectrum, sort of from feeling endangered to ill-at-ease to inconvenienced, and that exclusion is a sort of common foundation across those. That we can kind of then start to go and look in detail about how we ask the right questions around each of those, with sort of different lenses of safety around, firstly, freedom. Things we're looking for is freedom from violence, harassment and intimidation. So do I feel safe from the threat of violence in this space? Then around usability, so does the space meet my needs? And then around sense of belonging and participation, so do I feel welcome and empowered? And do I have a sense of ownership in this space? So that's all kind of encaptured in this question around safety. And clearly, perception is absolutely key here, and everybody's different, and everybody's responses in the same space could be quite different to that. And particularly somebody that's been triggered by trauma. And then just one other point that maybe hasn't been picked up on the panel yet in response to your opening question, I think around the people that are designing, developing, building and making decisions about our built environment are key to that question. So representation in the sector and the right skills within the sector are going to be absolutely central to how this agenda sort of lands.
No, I think that's really spot on, Sarah, and I think that'll sort of help me move on, because I think some of the questions, I think the opening questions are always really helpful in the sense that they allow everyone to sort of set the framing for the meeting, so naturally the questions below get answered. But some of the other questions I wanted to put back to the panel, and I'll come in just a moment to you, Susannah, is sort of, what impact does gender-biased design in the built environment on women and girls have, which I think we've actually already begun to answer. And then sort of following on to that, looking at, in your view, what are the benefits of taking a gender-informed approach over broader quality mainstreaming. So I don't want us to get sort of bogged down with the kind of terminologies around this issue. I think sometimes actually making this more accessible is better. But, basically trying to get to the point of, like, does gender planning effectively contribute to fostering a more inclusive society for women and girls, and what evidence is there to support this? I think that's probably where we'll land with the next question. But Susannah, did you want to come in and segue into that?
Just one thing, which is an overarching thing that is probably just, again, worth saying out loud. I was at a conference at the beginning of this week with Karen Wybrow, who does a lot of work around women's safety in the nighttime economy. And she'd been doing a safety walk with a group of women around Stratford Station, and she was asking them what the problems were. And first they were saying, there's a really terrible, we don't like the access there, it's the lighting. But she was sort of trying to unpick that, and she said, well, the dark isn't going to hurt you, and in the end the problem is the behaviour of men, and we just have to actually acknowledge that. But the woman who began the gender mainstreaming in Vienna said that she got a lot of flack for setting up a housing development based around the caring needs of women for children, and people saying, but men can do this too. And she said, yes, we have to be aiming for utopia but building for where we are now. And I think for this we also have to be building for where we are now but not losing sight of the behaviour change that is, in the end, at the bottom of all the stuff we are talking about.
I think that was so fascinating. Can you actually just tell me a little bit more about that specific conversation around building at where we are now and aspiring to where we want to get to, but that home being built around care needs that predominantly are held by women?
So Vienna was literally the city that invented gender mainstreaming. They went through their entire planning and looked at it through the lens of gender, and very handily translated their entire manual into English, which I can heartily recommend. She, as part of that, they created a huge housing development that was centred around women as childgivers. So the nurseries were near the home to make it easier. Just really simple things like stairs, you could get pushchairs up and down. And all the stuff that Taya was mentioning about trip chaining versus male journeys into the city. Every bit of that. And there was, like I said, there was a lot of criticism that we shouldn't just be assuming, and we get this with Make Space for Girls, but why are you assuming girls can't skateboard? There are other barriers. At the moment, we are not at that position where women are equal partners with men in childcare, where girls can just wander onto the skate park if they want. And so that was her response. And I think there's always this two-pronged approach that we can change the built environment to make things better for women and to make things feel safer, but we're still basically bodging the fundamental problem, which is, you can call it what you like, patriarchy, male behaviour, toxic masculinity, but that also has to be addressed.
Very helpful. Thank you, Susannah. Theo?
Just on that, I'm thinking about the case study that I worked on last year, which was in Bogota, centered around care for women, so basically caregivers. And also it was kind of a similar model of, the mayor coming in and setting sort of women at the top of the agenda. And as a result of that, they also created a subdivision called Secretary for Women for the whole sort of jurisdiction of Bogota. And their job was to essentially implement policies for women's safety, etc. And as a result of that, the care blocks were created, which is kind of an idea that's, centering the whole master plan around care and creating these essential kind of pinpoints, care blocks, which are, every 15 sort of minutes sort of radius, and they are centered around transport as well, and they provide, daycare services, also access for women to use computers, because a majority of that group happened to be uneducated, because a lot of their work was sort of spent taking care of families instead of going to school. So it's, you can then quickly see how sort of reorientating sort of, all these policies and planning ideas around care developed this kind of really interesting plan that really put women at the forefront. And then I guess on the flip side with that, they also created a school for men that was attached to that to teach men how to iron, how to change diapers, things like that, because in Latin America, there's a huge misogynistic sort of culture around like machismo, and to kind of get these men to start thinking how care work could look like if it was a shared burden rather than just putting it on women. So yeah.
Thank you. Those were really fantastic best practice examples and a lot of food for thought. I'm going to pass over to Assemblymember Berry to continue our line of questioning, and I think we're going to, there's a lot to be tangents coming back around on this committee today.
It's really hard to know where to go next with this. I've got two questions in front of me, and I think the key thing that links them both together are the sort of culture around where decisions are being made at the moment, and I think some of you have talked about that, and I can't remember who was mentioned representation. So essentially, this is open to anyone to answer, and I just like to ask, what is leading to the underrepresentation of women themselves and the gender lens, women's perspectives when plans are being made and decisions are being made, and what is being done about that? Marina, you have put your...
Thank you. A burning desire to actually answer this, because I've looked into this topic myself. So at LLDC for the past 3 years, we've been looking into the topic of gender-inclusive urban design and planning. And again, I'm coming back to something that I feel like we're going to discuss quite a lot today. It is evidence, it's a data representation. And the question is, why? Because women and girls, particularly women, do actually really care about their neighborhood, and they have a lot to say. So they do take ownership of the area where they live, and they do have a burning desire to tell you when you ask them. So I think there are a few issues that at least I've experienced looking into this topic. One is that today public engagement is a norm. So it's embedded in all of the policies, processes. Developers, when they come to talk to us, they don't, we don't talk about that. They just go to do. The problem is that it often can be add-on tokenistic approach, and the result of the information that we receive from developers doesn't really tell you who said what. Their argument is 100% people agreed, or 80% of people agree. Who are 80%? That might as well be just like one same type of person. It can be white women, educated white women, because one of the things that we found through our research is that intersectionality is huge. So white, let's say, just thinking about myself, I'm pretty privileged, educated, have a full-time job, can pay myself for a taxi if I feel in danger in a particular situations. What about people who are unemployed, women that is unemployed, disabled, etc., cannot find a taxi because, lack of accessibility of the taxi, million of questions to say. So this approach of just saying 60-80% support it doesn't tell anything. Gender disaggregated data is the key for us to start understanding type of the questions that we're asking. We're shying away as a profession, asking the questions that are uncomfortable and that we don't feel we don't know what to do with them. When we were doing our evidence-based research, we did the same. And I will be honest with kind of like a slight failures that we did, because I think it's important. We, at the time in 2021, we did this massive research because we had the same question. What does it feel good place for women and girls? So the assumption that we had, well, we did a one good thing, is like we shied away and we said we don't know. Let's say we don't know. Let's ask. We partner with UN UK Women Safer Places now. It's an initiative. They passed on the questionnaire. A lot of questions were not related to built environment, and we had temptation to rewrite them, to just ask what we want to know because of this liability issue of like, what do you do when someone talks about crime and you're just a planning authority? The good thing that we did is that UN UK Women insisted we use this, and we had to find a solution for this. And the solution was that we actually don't work in silos. So we thought, okay, sure, we're going to have a lot of information about crime, about antisocial behavior. Nothing of that falls within our remit. What we can do, because we have that power, is to partner with all of the organizations who can then take action. So we form Women and Girls Safety Project Board within LLDC, which is a project, stakeholders, Women and Girls Safety Stakeholders Board, which brings all of the relevant people to the table, police, education, all of the landowners, because often it's a land ownership issue. Like we cannot have control over what happens on certain, land ownership because we're limited as a planning authority. So they all sat down and we passed them on relevant information. They signed a charter with us to say that they are going to consider the data that we handed over to them and that we're going to work together and not in silo. And we meet bi-monthly, we discuss the topic, we share the data. So it is important how you ask the question, not to shy away from actually then receiving that information. And the other important thing is, women and girls are conditioned not to think about their needs. We just learn to live our lives navigating, keeping ourselves safe. When we engage with women and girls and you ask them the question, why you're uncomfortable here, they don't know how to answer because they never thought about that. You just know that you don't. So conditioning is a huge thing. And the third thing is barrier to women and girls engaging and telling you that information is that they are often involved in unpaid caring responsibilities. They don't have time, they don't have money, they cannot afford. And that's why we're taking approach of ensuring that we pay them for participation because they're experts, and it is really a huge barrier. And we've seen a huge successes when we actually financially compensate them for their time that they don't have. So it's a very complex topic, but in a nutshell, I do apologize. Like I'll let others talk as well. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to jump in at that point? I have further bits and pieces of questions that I can chuck in if that's helpful. Susannah?
I think just two small things. One is that on a policy basis, it's an absolute not. I always envisage it as it's like a really tangled ball of string, and you think you found one thing, so you pull that, and then you discover that 20 other things are are linked up to it. And so which is why I think the gender mainstreaming attitude of we're just going to look at everything is so important, because you solve one thing and there's knock-on effects. I think the biggest single barrier is just that people don't see it. It's just a lack of awareness, and once you bring it up into sight, then suddenly all sorts of different things can happen. But really, just that it's a problem hiding in plain sight, and we need to do that initial awareness work first.
Okay, thank you very much. Obviously, there's the planning system is partly policies, which I think we'll be asking about at the GLA level in a while. But it's also the practice of what gets considered when decisions are made and planning committees. Do any of you have any sense of the representation of women on planning committees as planning officers, writing reports, and whether that influences things? No. Okay. No.
I can come in a little, not on the planning side of things explicitly, but I mean, we certainly know that there's a really big problem with representation in the sector more broadly, and I think that has a really big impact on the ability to actually see through some of the recommendations that we're making about what good practice looks like in terms of bringing in more varied perspectives to the development process. We know that in our place shaping capacity survey, which is something that we do on a biannual basis, in 2022 that there were only 10 full-time equivalent inclusive design or accessibility officers across London, across all of the boroughs. We don't have, that was the first time we recorded that, so we don't have a baseline of data there, but we do know anecdotally that most boroughs were saying that in the past they've had at least one. So that's obviously a decline there. And then we also know that more broadly in the sector that there's a problem. So, for example, in the architecture sector, only 32% of jobs are held by women, and that's actually down from 2018 when it was at 40%. So there's a change there. I should say the 32% is from 2020, so that figure is a little out of date, but still you can see that there is some change there. So, you know, we've done some work to try and understand what the kind of barriers are at each stage. We've done work looking across an individual's career in the sector. What are the barriers that's all the way down from school age up to kind of setting up practice or kind of leadership stages. So there's a lot to kind of unpack there. But yeah, I think it's that kind of dual issue of the skills within the planning system, but also the skills within the skills and capability within the sector.
Okay, and can I just ask about within the GLA, what is being done to make sure there is more gender balance in things like the Mayor's Design Advocates, and is that quite a representative? Yeah, I suppose there are two things of interest there. There's the Mayor's Design Advocates, and then there's the A+U framework as well, the Architecture and Urbanism framework. So the Mayor's Design Advocates are in place. They're a group of 42 independent expert advisors, and they're in place to come in and provide design review advice, and also to kind of support various pieces of design research that are coming through the system, and also in some places actually go into places and help kind of with specific place-based issues. They are more than 50% female, and we went to a huge amount of effort in the recruitment process of the Mayor's Design Advocates to really be clear about the fact that we were looking for a very representative panel, and I think that really helps. They're not just in terms of their representation, but also their expertise. So we have quite a few people within that cohort that are actually experts in gender planning and gender design as well. And then since then, we've also been through a process of upskilling the cohort as a whole in terms of looking at gender issues. So there's a really good sort of knowledge base there and expertise base there. And I think that question around design review panels is quite interesting, because while we've seen a kind of decline in inclusive design and accessibility officers in boroughs, we've seen a real increase in design review panels in boroughs, which could be an opportunity to start to use those more to speak to and to provide scrutiny around what good, inclusive and accessible design looks like. That was going to be my next question, is how are we influencing those? Do you have any recommendations for how we could ask the Mayor to do more to influence who sits on the design review panels, or just to spread best practice as far as he's...
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Mayor's Design Advocates and the London Review panel, so that's our in-house design review panel that mainly focuses on where there's the Mayor's making either planning decisions or investments, but there is capacity for boroughs to take that up. It doesn't happen all that often, because actually most authorities now have their own design.
Yeah, that's what I mean. In terms of influencing, making sure those design panels are gender.
Yeah, and we've done some work because it is quite a, it's a real constellation of design review panels, and they're really varied in terms of their size and what they look at and their kind of expertise. So we've done some work to try and provide a little bit of consistency across the piece by producing a charter, and the idea is that local design review panels sign up to that charter, and it's got a series of sort of principles within that. One is around representation and one is around inclusivity. And we also work quite a bit with UDL, Urban Design London, who bring that whole kind of constellation of panels together on a regular basis and provide kind of upskilling and learning and cross-sharing. So there's a really good sort of healthy scene there, and I think there's a good understanding both in terms of the sort of skills that are needed, but also this ongoing mission to make those design review panels across London more representative.
Okay, thank you. I saw that Tayo had your hand up, and then Susannah. I don't know if you want to go in a different order. And then Olivia, I'll bring you in as well, finally.
I'm going to say a very short thing that I could expand into a longer thing about, but basically a lot of the problems are baked in long before you get to the planning committee. This is what I mean about the knot of policy. There is so much, certainly if looking specifically at green space, so much of the agenda is already decided before it gets anywhere. I'm looking at pitches policies, I'm looking at guidance from Field and Trust, all that sort of stuff. And in planning regulations, the actual powers of the planning committee, it's too late by then. You need to be much further up the system to make.
There's not a lot of discretion for the planning officer writing the report or the committee to bring things in because they're quite prescribed. Is that what you're sort of saying?
Yes, and the way that a lot of guidance then gets written into planning guidance, developers then want to get their development through, so they follow the planning guidance. When the planning, to give you an example, skate parks 85% used by boys, Moogers 92% by boys. So much planning guidance.
Can you expand on Mooger? Sorry, I just realised that was
Moogers are the fenced pitches, cages.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
They are 92% used by boys and young men. So much Fields and Trust guidance says facilities for teenagers such as skate parks and Moogers. That gets written into the planning guidance. The developers then go, we want to get our development through, let's put a skate park on the Mooger in, because that's what the council want. So by the time you're at the planning, and don't even get me started on playing pitches, also 90% used by men and boys, and you can't even take one out without permission without consulting Sport England. So by the time you can end up with a park that is basically default male as part of your development, the planning officer can't turn the whole thing round by that stage.
Right, yeah, we'll have more questions about that later. Tayo, do you have something to add?
Yeah, just wanted to say that, that I think a democratic sort of approach should be taken when you are sort of, creating these assemblies, committees, etc. Because it's one thing to reach out to those who lead practices, for instance, for advice, but then it's another thing to reach out to a girl who's really sort of experienced that space, and I think Marina has talked about that in general. So I think it's to really kind of cast your net wide in terms of who you are talking to, who you are engaging to, because again, when I'm thinking of sort of the design advocates, it is probably someone that's at a senior level rather than a teenage girl. But I don't know how that would sort of look like. But I think a democratic approach is needed. I think the other thing that should be considered is how we hold these committees accountable for what's really being done. And I think, part of it is really awareness, but I think accountability is really, really needed to see sort of where that work is going and how it's progressing.
Interesting, thank you. And Olivia? I'll hand back to you, Chair. Sorry, this is too interesting.
Just responding to a little bit more about what Sarah was saying about having that diversity in those areas of planning and development. I think one of the issues as well is that, it's really important to make it clear that things like gender mainstreaming or gender sensitive planning is beneficial for everyone. It's beneficial for individuals who identify as young women, it's beneficial for those who identify as young men, it's beneficial for gender diverse people. And I think that there needs to be more of a discussion or a culture around that actually, men are invited to the table, because I think even if it's totally in good faith and they think that I'm not going to engage in this conversation because this isn't my place. There is a place for men to engage in those conversations around gender. So I think it's also facilitating that there's a shared burden around it, and also there's shared positive outcomes from having a gender-sensitive approach, which I think we're not really there yet. And so it's great to see a room full of women, but also it'd be amazing to then, have this conversation again and have a room full of, a wider range of people.
Just people.
Just people.
Quite right. I mean, that's the same thing in wider feminism, isn't it? The patriarchy hurts everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Berry, and I think we're going to be drilling down now into some of the aspects around public spaces specifically, so I'm going to hand over to Assemblymember Baker for that.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, panel, for really interesting, expansive conversation so far. Most of the questions I'm going to ask we've sort of touched upon, so please don't feel that that I want to give you an opportunity to make sure the views on those specific questions have come out. So the first question is actually, we have touched upon a lot, but I think I'd really still like to answer it and focus on it, which is, in what ways do the design of urban spaces impact both the safety and perceived safety of women? Can we start with Marina? But really interested to hear from any of you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I do apologise. I'm not quite sure I know how to use this raising my hands or not, so I'll be just physically raise my hand. So sorry.
There's no way of electronically raising your hands.
Okay, good to know.
So I don't know what you're pressing.
The buttons.
If you are pressing it, we don't know what you're doing. So please do. Yeah.
Apologies, because at some point I would like us to just slightly go back to the previous topic, because I think it's very important where we tackle the issue, and it has to be at the very core where it happens, and it's a project brief and so on. But in terms of what elements of public spaces do impact perception of safety, there are a lot of research and a really good research. I mean, a lot, not sufficient, but good amount out there for us to understand what that actually is. So I mentioned that in 2021 we went out with the same question, asking women and girls that are living and using public spaces within the LLDC area, and nothing will come as a surprise. Public lighting is the top priority, is the key. And also, what is important there is for us to think that the time of the day, the season of the year is also really important. So nothing can be looked in isolation in that sense. So when we're talking about the light, we're thinking about that after dark hours. So, and to be honest, I know GLA is doing some great work on the nighttime economy, and there are nighttime assessment. We're talking a lot more about that. But I think the problem is that we're still designing places from 9 to 5, because that's when we work. It was that architects, not strictly 9 to 5, but, daytime hours. The other thing is maintenance and, how the places are kept. That signals often women and girls that, if there are graffiti, if it's not managed well, it does signal that no one is looking after this place. You shouldn't be here. There's no one here to help you, and etc. And to be honest, a lot of things that came out from our research was really what the problem is, and that is antisocial behavior and also those social norms. So, of course, you want to be overlooked, so how we design impacts that natural and passive surveillance that can be done in a positive way, to busy places, to quiet places. So these are all things. Narrow walkways, so anything, one of the second kind of a built environment, shall we say, feature that we know for sure will impact is the place where you don't see very well who is approaching you, where you cannot, the place that is not legible, so you don't know where you're going, there's no signage, there's no wayfinding, there's no escape routes. So let's say you're stuck on this, and in our case that was canals were, as a hotspot, because you're kind of stuck there, there's a water, and there's, usually nothing happening in terms of any activities. So I think we have a clear idea what that is, and it is really helpful. We actually, in preparing our handbook document, focus on the 12, so from our research we came out to 12 specific design conditions, should we say, that hugely impact perception of safety.
Yeah. Does anyone have anything to Susannah, Olivia, and Theo? Okay, all of you. Susannah first.
There's a great piece of work that was done by Leeds University last year, which was funded by the Safer Streets Fund and the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, I think. But they did some in-depth sociological interviews with women and girls specifically around safety in parks. So much of it is basically what Marina said, and actually I think rather than go through it all, yes. It's out there. There's two key things that I think is worth taking for it. One is, and we've touched on this before, not all women think the same thing. What they did is they found clustered viewpoints of agreement, some of which was you've got to change society, some of which was actually lighting and access, but they also crucially found areas of agreement. And the number one thing that makes women and girls feel safe, in this case in parks, is seeing other people like me. It's not necessarily about design. Design is part of that process, but it's also about activation, senses of belonging, engagement, all of those things. So as part of that, or rather moving on from that, along with us, Make Space for Girls, and crucially the Green Flag Awards for parks, so it's disseminated to everybody involved in parks, there's now a set of Safer Parks guidance, which is now part of the judging for the Green Flag Awards. So every park award is also assessed on the safety of the park, which I think is a great step forward. But that sets it out for any stakeholders, things that you can do to make things better.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Olivia.
Yeah, I think Marina touched on this a bit, but just to add to that, that knowledge that we do know that, man-on-man violence, that is the most common form of violence in public space, but that the experience of fear actually has a greater impact on how women engage in public life. And so in some of the research that we did actually with Make Space for Girls, we found that a 25-year-old young woman, because of the experience of fear, has less mobility than a 16-year-old boy, which is quite astounding when you consider that a 16-year-old boy is still a child, is legally still a child. So I think that there are certain things that are just like, that distinction is really important when we're talking about gender. And then I think it's important to remember, and I don't remember who mentioned this, I think it was you, Susannah, or maybe it was Marina, but that we obviously can't design out things like misogyny and like the patriarchy, and that the lighting is not going to fix that issue. But yeah, but that it does let people know if they're included, and also on what terms they're included.
Thank you. Theo?
Yeah, I was just gonna give more or less practical examples from some of the work that's been done at Atkins around visibility. There's been sort of interesting projects going around on kind of your perception of what you can see versus what you can't see, and I know Marina kind of mentioned that, and that's something that can be measured. So for instance, when you're walking through an area that has scaffolding, for example, your line of sight actually doesn't tell you what's around the corner, and that in itself can bring about fear. So a lot of work has been done at Atkins, looking at lines of sight, visibility. Is it sort of designing out some sort of spaces when you are walking up a hill that you can't see around the corner. So practical things can be done to at least help push forward towards the feeling of safety. Another thing is memory and trauma, and that's been mentioned as well by Julia and Susannah. Places where incidents have happened before, or you may have a relative, friend, etc., or something that you've read on the news that can actually alter your sense of safety. And then unintended users, which is something I think that we aren't really thinking about as much. Who occupies spaces, at night, or maybe even during the day that you feel like you want to use, but then you can't end up using. I know, Susannah, we've worked together in Oxford, and that particular shelter that ended up being built for the girls, but then ended up being occupied by unintended users, etc. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's been picked up a bit already, but I suppose the way that we approached this work through our design research, which I should mention is led by Publica and Dr. Ellie Cosgrave and her team, but there was a real sort of basis of understanding there that there is no sort of one-size-fits-all solution or correct design solution or spatial configuration that is right. So the focus really was around the processes and how to make the processes more inclusive and centred around women, girls and gender diverse people's needs. So we sort of structured that by looking really across the kind of lifespan of a building, from sort of project setup stages, so what can be done around sort of resourcing and a commitment in briefs and who's taking the lead and what sorts of resources are needed to make it work well, through to the work to kind of understand what's needed on a site, and that's really about the kind of bringing in views of local people and co-design processes, through to the actual design and the making, and then all the way through to how it's used and the kind of ongoing management plans and the ongoing programming of those spaces. So we never really landed on the stage of like you need X amount of lighting or X amount of seating. It was much more about how we can inform the process and equip the sector with the understanding to be able to really know from the outset what this involves to do well.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. And just like to say, and so just like to bring Alison in and Sarah, if you've got anything more to say. Just to say, and Sarah, you've already been talking about this, but in your work with the GLA, how do you consider the safety and accessibility of public spaces? And by the way, this is going to be very annoying because you've very explicitly said that you don't have specifics, that it's about engaging people and making the right one. But are there any specific examples of design features that are aimed at enhancing safety for women and other vulnerable groups that you would like to bring out, with the caveat that you're not saying one size fits all? Well, is that helpful?
Yeah, I mean, what we sort of went on to do is then start to test these principles through projects. So we worked across 10 projects, and I'll just caveat with a very, very measly budget. So it was basically about taking our cohort of upskilled Mayor's Design advocates and using their time and experience and expertise to go in and shape projects, 10 projects, all at very different kind of stages in their development cycle, from very early kind of brief writing all the way through to looking at post-occupancy, to test those principles that I just talked through in practice. And I think what's interesting is the kind of outcomes looked very different in different places. So for example, in one place at Kidbrooke Station Square, that was about kind of looking at redesigning a kind of linear park to be more focused around young girls' needs, and brought in a cohort of girls to kind of help shape that and almost design review that as it came forward, through to, I talked about the post-occupancy evaluation at Black Horse Road, which was a completed Barrett's development, housing development, going around and doing a kind of daytime and nighttime walk with female residents to have a look at what's working and what's not working, and how that might inform the ongoing kind of management plan and the kind of post-occupancy evaluation that goes back to the developer to inform how they might go forward. So, like I say, it's not. It's when it's applied, that's when the kind of learnings come out in terms of what that looks like for kind of spatial and practical responses.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Alison, did you have anything to add?
Within my role at TfL, we assess, my team assess planning applications, and we look at the transport offer and the transport mitigation which goes along with planning applications. And if I had £1 for every time you get asked what lighting do you want in the subway, but it really depends on where it is and who's using it and etc. And also, I don't want it to be a tick box. And I remember I watched your last committee where we talked about secure by design, and I don't want to go into that, but there are pros, you know, that you would meet that level of lighting, but there are also cons about it and how you apply it, and there's such a blanket and sort of the unthoughtfulness and picking up what the community actually wants and how the place is used and all this kind of stuff. So we are writing new guidance, and it isn't going to give a lot of the industry, the transport industry wants this. Yes. What does the feeling of safety looks like? Give me a tick box. Yeah. That's not going to happen. They're not going to be getting that. They're going to be getting engage with your community. Think about from the user, the end user, what are the trips that makes a successful development? Think about them and work with your design colleagues as well, and your lighting colleagues, which all these developers have, to create a space which is fit for purpose for that situation and that location, not one size fits all. So yeah, that's the only thing I would add.
Well, that's quite a big thing, and good luck with your challenge of getting transport people to actually speak to lots of women. Thanks very much. I'm going to come back to Susannah and ask. We've talked a lot about your research into parks, but I just wonder whether you could tell us about the exclusion of teenage girls that comes about in sort of the current way parks are designed and what impact that has on them.
Yeah, well, at the moment, as I've sort of implied, when we provide facilities for teenagers, and this is written into all sorts of guidance, all sorts of planning stuff, it tends to be three things: the skate park, the BMX track, and the Muga cage, fenced pitch, whatever you want to call it. We did a sort of point survey of various councils across the country, and 90% of the facilities provided by teenagers are those. Aggregated, they are 90% used by teenage boys and young men. So, and literally, there is nothing. The only other option is basically a shelter. There's all sorts of reasons why this happens, but mostly it's like I said, people have just not seen the issue. There are genuinely 3 pieces, tiny, there's probably 100 grand has been spent on stuff for teenage girls, 3 projects across all of the UK, of which Theo worked on with one of them. So we've got quite a long way to go. The only reason we have this data is because we've collected the data. Yeah. Nobody else. And I think somebody said, you know, if you care about something, you count it. And we just haven't considered gender in this way. But there's so much to unpack in that question. There are real design issues around this. It's not. It's a combination of design and social things, and social things that we can also to some degree design out. So particularly with fenced pitches, if you just think about it for a minute, and as soon as everyone goes, oh yeah, 2 metre high fences, narrow entrances, sometimes chicaned, full of teenage boys. I'm not going to go in there as a grown woman. Of course teenage girls don't feel they can access those, and yet they are the most common facility. Nobody knows how many they are. We just keep churning them out and going, oh, let's build a Muga. We've dealt with the teenagers with that. Skate parks, ditto, a big bowl structure. So if you're learning, you've got a load of expert teenage boys just standing round the edge. But also teenage boys territorialise these spaces. They see them as their own. When we talk to girl skateboarders, they've had stones thrown at them, they've had racial abuse, they've had rape threats. They say, oh, I get up early in the morning. This is teenagers getting up early in the morning to go to the skate park when the boys aren't there. Oh, I go when it's rainy, the surface isn't as good, but the boys aren't there. What happens is we also create what I've taken to calling bloke parks, because the other part of the equation is pitches, which are very much in planning policy. And this is a really interesting data point, because we actually have the data, but nobody has collected it, because councils have to produce a playing pitch policy. For my sins, I have read 120 playing pitch policies, because they contain gender disaggregated data about teens, but nobody's ever added it up until me and my spreadsheet. And so I can tell you that pitches are also 90% used by men and boys, but they're mandated by everything, and you can't take one out without talking to Sport England, all this stuff. But so between all these things, you can end up with, and this was not in London, you'll be pleased to hear. So we were called in, because they realised they had a problem, to a park in the middle of England, we'll just say. It was legacy planning permission. They put the planning permission in 7 years ago. But as a result of all of these pressures, they'd ended up with 2 pitches, a clubhouse, a Muga and a skate park. The thing that basically sent me over the edge was there was one remaining area of grass, and that had been labelled kickabout area. But what this tells us is we are creating predominantly male spaces. And we worked with Theo on a park in Oxford where it was very much a wreck. You know, it's got all the pitches laid out. The girls told us that the pitch lines were man-spreading because it felt that all of these male teams owned all of this space and they were on the fringes. And if they sat down on the grass and somebody came along with the ball, they had no right to the space. And crucially, it's like, you know, because of all the things we talked about with harassment, if you've got a park that's got a skate park and a Muga and pitches and they're covered in men, you don't want to go in that place. It's just a giant ban space where people are going to shout rubbish at you. So there's a whole heap of stuff as to why they feel designed out. But it all comes together into spaces that are really not for them at all. And I will say one positive thing, though, because we're not very good at designing for teenagers, full stop. The good thing about Mugas and skate parks is that they give teenage boys a right to be there. You cannot, it's not conceptually possible to tell off a teenage boy for loitering on the skate park. You know, it's just, you can't do it. So what we need to do is find ways, and this goes very much to the we're all experimenting, we're testing things out. We need to know what the spaces look like to make teenage girls feel that they belong. Yeah. And, you know, very much, like I said, I just want to say one thing that actually in the policy thing, gender budgeting, really, really important, because we use this a lot with pitches, because it changes the dynamic. If I tell a council, your pitches are 90% used by men and boys, they go, what can I do about this? There's no problem. If you turn around and say, for every £100,000 you spend on pitch maintenance, £90,000 is going to men and boys, where is the other money you're spending on women and girls? Suddenly it's something they have agency over. It's such a simple trick, but it completely changes the dynamic.
Thanks very much. Marina, I saw you indicating, were you about to make that point?
Just to say, I mean, nothing to add, obviously, to what Susannah said. She's an absolute expert, but we're so lucky to actually have Make Space for Girls, because upskilling is a huge thing within the industry. And I mean, we have a story which is actually beautiful, because we have involvement from Make Space for Girls, but also GLA supported us. Actually, we all know hear each other because we worked on many projects. It's all novelty to us, so we always shout to each other and like, help me. Yeah. So one of the interesting, for example, I mean, it's kind of like a very interesting story to me. Like we're designing the place for teenagers, and we are actually lucky at LLDC to have a youth voice group which is very involved in planning. So we had a workshop with them with teenage boys and teenage girls, and you know, they told us what they would like this place to look like, and that was before we embarked this journey. Then we got to know Make Space for Girls, do more project, and we looked back at the project and we were like, I don't know, even this illustration is male dominated. So it's kind of like, have we done this right? Like we had this confidence of like, well, we had teenage girls in the room, so they told us they, I guess, want this. So we went back to revisit, and we invited Make Space for Girls, and they came and had a session, and goes back to this conditioning of women and girls. So when we went back with that proposal, we asked the question, instead of like, what teenage space for teenagers look like, but instead like, would you use this place? They said no, and we were like, but you told us to design. And they were like, well, yeah, but that's to design teenage place for teenagers, not for us. And that was a shock for us. We were like, hold on, like, so it's like all along you were telling us, but that is because they don't really know what the good looks for them. That if you ask the teenage girl, what do you want? Like, how would she know when she never seen anything? So then the beautiful thing is, like, it's a long story, but then we got a help from GLA, from Mayoral Design Advocates, and we said, let's do this from scratch. Like, let's just accept we don't know what it looks like. So we tested this beautiful approach. It's not co-design, it's co-clienting, where the teenage girls were clients. They wrote the brief. Now that's not easy for even a professional, nonetheless the teenage girls, but with the help of GLA and the tiny fund, but it went a long way, and mayoral design advocate, we actually upskilled them to write a brief. They were telling us what they want, and it was very interesting. You know, what they want is a place where they can share memories, somewhere where they can be seen, something where they, you know, like they can hear that someone is coming. Now, in design terms, that doesn't tell you what it is, but skilled architects can really take this information and turn into something that they know. So it's a long process, it's a long journey in front of us, but we just need to keep doing it, and looking at the data, asking the right questions, and not shy away from the fact that we also don't know how that looks like.
Thanks, Marina. Olivia, and then I'll come back to Susannah.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I think we found that in our work as well, and in our work with Make Space for Girls as well, that this time of, like, you really need to give time and space to these projects, and you need to do that also to create a space of, like, trust, of sharing, and also of unlearning. So there's a lot of things that we have normalized as women, and there's a lot of things that young women have also internalized, and that you do need to go through those processes of being like, well, why did you suggest that football pitch if you're not going to use it? You know what I mean? Who is using it? What's the idea behind that? And I think we had that kind of like one of the little clicks for us maybe on our research project is that we asked a group of young women, do you feel safe in your local area? And like I was kind of referencing that before, but a lot of them said, yes, absolutely, we feel safe in our local area. And then we asked them, well, do you go out at night? No. Do you feel comfortable, you know, walking home from the bus? No. Do you only go out when, you know, you're with another friend? Yes. Or like, okay, so safety, clearly, we have an issue that we need to unpack, but something like a simple survey doesn't give you that following data. So you really do need to create the time and the space to have those conversations, to be able to do some of that unlearning, and then to build on like, okay, so if it's not a football pitch, what could it be? What can we imagine? What can we, you know, think would be a space that we can actually use?
Thanks. So Susannah and then Taya.
Yeah, I suspect there's going to be a question about this in a bit, but I'm just going to flag up. There has been some really good work done with co-design with teenage girls in Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, particularly in Sweden. So we also, you know, part of slightly short-circuiting that process can also be there's really good stuff that we can show them and that then sparks their ideas and their enthusiasm.
I think I'm not sure we are specifically going to ask that, so yeah, it would be really helpful to see that. I'm sure. So.
I think because so much of it is really about pretty pictures.
Yeah.
We have a range of case studies on our website.
Yes.
But the key examples. There was a park in Malmo.
Yeah.
And Malmo had a really interesting project where they were taking small unused corners of urban space and turning them into spaces for teenagers. After a while, they realised that 12 out of the 14 were skate parks, and across the 14, they were 80% used by boys. So the next one was co-designed by teenage girls. Yes. Now, there's two really crucial things about the result. One is the girls loved the process so much that they actually stayed together as a group and kind of became a community interest company to help other groups of girls do the same thing. So that sense of ownership and belonging comes out of the co-design process. Yeah. Crucially, that park is now 50-50 used by boys and girls. Because one of the criticisms we sometimes get is, oh, you want gendered spaces. And it's like, no, we want more inclusive spaces. Gendered spaces is what we have at the moment. So, but girls are so designed out and have so basically given up that it takes that level of involvement to do it. The other place is Umeå in Sweden, which I really recommend. They've sort of taken Vienna's gender mainstreaming and they've applied it across the whole city. My favourite example, which is not about teenage girls, is they have a hospital on the outskirts of the city, and they realised that a lot of the staff were women and they were working antisocial shifts, and they all came in and out of this one particular station. So they focused their efforts on making that station the safest place on the network. And it's that kind of joined-up thinking that I think is where gender mainstreaming really comes into its own. But they also designed an amazing space for teenage girls. Umeå is right in the north of Sweden. So if you're not going out in the darkness, you're not going out for quite a lot of the year. So they created a lit space in a park. It's got beautiful sight lines. And again, it works. It's used by lots of people in the daytime. In the early evening, it's full of teenage girls, and it looks great. So there are lots of precedents, and that's really crucial in our work for both showing designers and landscapers what you could do and what it might look like, but also for showing girls what just a bit of the menu of possibilities is. Also swings, they love swings.
Fully understood. Taya.
Yeah, I guess that related to my point. I remember, Susannah, when we were working on that park in Oxford, one of the codes that kind of stood out to me was, why should I go to the park? There's nothing for me there. Like, there's literally nothing. And I think, it's acknowledging that, that these girls want to be out there, to have the desire to be out there. And, I know we mentioned a lot sort of the gendered disparities between sort of boys and girls, but then there's also an issue that kept cropping up, which was around sort of young children and playgrounds. The fact that you would get teenage girls that would want to use swings because, they still want to play, around the age of 12, etc. and onwards, but they can't because there's toddlers on the playground, and that makes them also feel like they can't use those spaces. So it's, again, when we are creating these MUGAs, is also, in addition to that, is those sort of playgrounds that are kind of age restricted, and then give also, with parents that access those areas, kind of giving them the feeling that they can't be there, and that it is strictly for sort of really young children. So I think it's part of also looking at that difference between two, and the right to play, essentially, for all ages.
That's really helpful. I think I'm coming up to being massively over my time, so I'm just going to ask one brief question to wrap it up, which is, with all the things that we've been talking about, particularly around parks and public spaces, what more could the GLA do to support that work? I don't know whether GLA has any views. Susannah.
We've got the legislation in the form of the Equalities Act. Do a decent equalities impact assessment on every single design and bit of equipment, because now that we've got the data on who's using them, I personally don't think it's a few years before we can justify building another skate park, really.
That's really helpful. Anything else? No, I think that's back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Assembly Baker. I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'll come to you first, Susannah, if that's okay, and asking particularly about how women are afforded equal access to public infrastructure. We've obviously touched on parks. I wanted to ask specifically about toilets.
Oh yes, toilets are actually a human rights issue, and they are the thing that is most likely to go in budget cuts. They're also most likely to be not designed to feel particularly safe. This is another one of the areas where we advocate for teenage girls, but we're actually advocating to create more inclusive spaces. Teenage girls are wrestling with their periods. There's research that shows that 1 out of every 3 teenage girls at some point during their adolescence doesn't want to be more than 20 minutes from a toilet. If you don't provide a toilet, they're staying at home. And in a way, this is part of the bigger problem with infrastructure. And this is actually the main reason why I do this, because what our public spaces say to women and girls at the moment is, you belong at home. And I really thought we were over that. It's also worth knowing that in Victorian times, when women were going out more, they were starting to build public toilets, there was an active campaign against them so that women should stay at home. But obviously, older people, pregnant, young mothers, all of these people are going to need toilets more frequently. A fascinating thing out of London, one of the things we see generally is that girls will travel to a good park. And a good park means a park with decent toilets. It's really crucial. And in London, because they have bus passes, they can actually be really selective. We were talking to girls from Edgware who were going to Watford because it was a great park with great toilets. So yes, it's absolutely, we have a list of recommendations, and that's on the list.
Yeah, I could just take a moment to say welcome. I think we've got, if I understand correctly, the Urban Regeneration Master's students from the University of College London. Is that you guys? Hey, well, look, welcome. Really great to have you here. I'm sure everything will be pretty self-explanatory, but right now, I'll pass back over to Assemblyman Bess. We are, I'm sure you've been told, discussing gender-informed planning. So how do we ensure that the built environment and the design of our cities enable women to feel safe, girls, young girls especially, and feel, you know, that sort of expand our understanding of what that word safety means, actually. But I'll pass back over to Emma.
Thanks, Susannah. Theo and then Marina.
Yeah, so forgive me, Olivia, maybe I stole your point, but from reading sort of one of the reports that Olivia and Julia kind of put together, it was interesting to see that also young girls are spending more money going to sort of places that have access to toilets, like a McDonald's or a coffee shop, because they feel like they can have that sort of access to public clean amenities, and that really sort of alters as well their journeys, and how much sort of they're spending time. So I think that's kind of an important thing to note.
Thanks, Marina.
Thank you. So I just want to focus, absolutely crucial, public toilets, massive topic, very important topic. But I just wanted to outline like two actually good things if we're talking about the planning. London Plan has a standalone policy on public toilets, which is gender sensitive. And for such a strategic policy, I dare to say it's a very good one, because it is a gender sensitive. And I think in terms of, you know, policy, it's really you know, it's commendable that we do have a policy on public toilets, because it is important. Now, application of that policy, we also have a good example. The City of London, they have toilet community scheme, if I'm not mispronouncing that. I was looking actually, what does that mean in practice? Like, how can you actually achieve you know, through planning, that you get accessible public toilets. And the key things there, why it is successful, is because they understood that, I mean, not just women and girls, but a lot of people, particularly old people, before is that confidence that that you're going to have access to public toilet gives you if you know and you plan before you take your journey. So one of the brilliant things they did is they mapped. So there is application where you can actually prepare yourself if you're within the City of London to know where you can access public toilets. The other really good thing is that often women and girls, there is one study that, and I think like we don't need a study, like we know from our own experience, public toilets can be perceived a little bit unsafe, and they're, you know, maintenance and management issue. So women and girls more likely would want to use public, like a toilets within the commercial unit, so within the bar or a restaurant, because they know they will be overlooked. They know someone is taking care of that. So City of London actually partners with the commercial units and negotiates accessibility of the public toilets to you know, public. And what is really, really nice is that they use this little symbols, I guess, the stickers on the shop front, so that you actually, while you're walking, you know where you're welcome. Because I think we all did when we, you know, sneaked into a restaurant to use, and we pretended we were, you know, like just there. So you pick the one that is the busiest, so they don't notice that you're entering and going obviously just to the toilet. So I think it's like, you know, there are good things out there in London where I think we can learn from. So policy exists, it's a good one. Application also, we have a good example. I haven't done the research to see anywhere else, but you know, that's a good one. So yeah, it's a good example, I think, of how it can be done.
Yeah, I think that scheme also runs in Richmond and possibly some other London boroughs. It's probably pushing the boundaries of the planning committee, but we actually made a recommendation a couple of years ago on the health committee that the TfL should adopt the toilets onto the map, basically to show where that there should be a layer you can put onto the TfL map to see where you can go to a public toilet.
And sorry, just going back to the same topic, but also like through our survey, women and girls reported that there is no access to toilet when we know there is a toilet. And then you start thinking through planning and design, and you think, well, it's an issue of wayfinding and signage. So it's very important, and that's why we need to look holistically. So it's not just about toilet, it is also about wayfinding and signage. Toilets maybe exist, it's just like you cannot find it.
Thanks. And perhaps thinking particularly as well around what more the Mayor could do to improve provision and design of toilets in London for women and girls. We talked about the supplementary guidance, but of course things like TfL is a big opportunity. So if there's anything panels wanted to add to that. Panel, no? Okay, yeah, Sarah.
I could just briefly talk about some of the regeneration funding programs. So, for example, the Good Growth Fund, where there has been, I mean, the projects are not driven, obviously, by toilet provision, but where there is opportunity for toilet provision, that's, I think, been explored and pushed as far as possible. So I think, I'm not sure of the figure exactly, but I think the Good Growth Fund has created and opened up over 300 more toilets through those projects. So I think there's just something interesting there about where the Mayor is investing in built projects to look for those opportunities to be delivering toilet provision through that investment.
Thanks. And I'm sure that members of the panel would want as many toilets as possible on the TfL network without saying the obvious. It kind of needs to also be said by panel members. Otherwise it's just me saying it. Okay. Thanks. We're going to move on to more wider transport and TfL issues.
Assemblyman Best, just before we move on to transport, can Assemblyman Berry just come in on toilets? Thank you. Just really briefly.
It isn't about toilets. I wanted to go back to just ask a quick question based on what you were saying a bit ago, Susannah, about women and girls using or young girls using their travel passes to go to the better parks. And I wondered if there was any information about that, because knowing what the better parks are would be really useful, and just to do it all in one go. I've also been a councillor for Hampstead Heath for a very long time, and it's definitely spent a lot of time there, and it's definitely noticeable that groups of girls travel there to spend time, and there's something about that. There's a very wide range of sort of habitats and spaces there. But I think the fact that there's more informal or wild spaces and lots of different places people can spend time is attracting people. But if there's any data or any information you can feed back on what a good park, what these good parks are, they might not be able to articulate why they're better, but and beyond toilet provision, which is obviously a consideration, yes. And there are plenty on the Heath.
That specific bit of work was done with a developer in Edgware, so it was just talking to a group of girls in Edgware. So this is what's fascinating.
So it's really anecdotal.
Well, it's not anecdotal because they were really clear about it. Yeah. But we don't have a big survey of teenage girls in parks, but we do. And also, I think this goes back to intersectionality. Every group of girls' experience, within London is really different. So these were predominantly white girls in Edgware who were very free to range. We did some research recently in Somerstown, behind King's Cross, and a lot of the girls were children of first-generation Somali immigrants. Some of them were going out to Camden Lock. Some of them were not going anywhere without an adult with them. So, there's just such a huge amount of intersectionality at play. But the Hampstead Heath thing is interesting because there's, whenever I'm giving a presentation, I always say to the architects and designers, if there's one thing they take away, it's to create lots of different spaces. I've alluded to that with the Muga and the single space that gets taken over. The more different spaces there are, the more different groups, and this doesn't just apply to teenage girls, it applies to the boys who don't want to use the Muga, it applies to LGBTQA plus teenagers. All sorts of people can use the park simultaneously without feeling threatened. And Hampstead Heath is obviously a brilliant example of that. If there's somebody looking dodgy, you can go somewhere else. But I think the other thing, and this came at the work we did in Oxford, is that sometimes I think we underestimate teenagers, not just teenage girls. They don't just want the shelter on the sort of green desert. They really like a rich experience of nature. And this comes through, the work we did in Oxford was funded by Natural England, and it was about experiences of green space and nature. And whenever you do, sometimes we do collaging work, and they're all about the flowers. Literally, some of them produce planting schemes. And in a bit of work we've done in Bradford, it's a tiny budget. They didn't just want facilities. They wanted a a wildflower meadow. They wanted flowering trees. They came down, they weren't asked. This is this ownership thing again, to plant the wildflower meadow. So that's, you know, I can see why Hampstead Health, it'd be amazing to review London parks through the lens of teenage girls. But to go back to the intersectionality thing, another reason they travel is particularly for some ethnic groups. Dogs are a problem. Dogs are a problem because they're unclean. Dogs are a problem because racist people use them aggressively. And there is a really interesting research project was done around the Olympic Park a while ago. But what they found is that a lot of people from minoritised ethnic groups travel to the royal parks because the dog restrictions are much stricter and they're very well used. So, you know, it's not just that whole travel thing is a really interesting picture.
Well,
but
I mean, what I'll do is take away some thoughts on where we might ask for more information, particularly some of the surveys Transport for London do might know about trip purposes and things like that. But I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Barry, that would be helpful. Back over to you, Sonia Best, for the transport section. And thank you for allowing that little intervention.
Okay, thank you. If I could look first to Alison, if that's okay, to ask in what ways are women and girls disadvantaged by London's public transport?
I think we've got the sort of more broader issues around public transport, not just in London, but the way public transport has been developed across the country and probably across the world, in terms of, we go back to sort of the way it's been designed for men and the way it has been focused on the journey to work. My area within planning, and looking at in terms of planning applications, seeing new developments as having this is an opportunity to make a difference, an opportunity to make a change. What I've been trying to do and we've mentioned it quite a few times here, is just highlighting how influential the route is from your front door to the station, which historically within the transport industry is quite an overlooked element. The transport industry is very much concerned between station to station, and that is something which is historically, you know, I started in operational transport, and that's how you build business cases, etc. But within the planning application world, where I'm trying to focus, and TfL writes its guidance for developers to, when they assess their transport, test their transport mitigation, is actually focusing on, as I said before, the transport needs of that development and the people that live in it. So moving away, yes, the trip to work is really, really important. But what about the other trips? What about to the community centre? What about to places of worship? What about to school? And requiring, but most of the time it's forcing a developer to think about those trips. And not just from, it's fairly near the station. Well, if someone is, what we find in TfL research and other research we've mentioned here, if women and girls are fearing that trip from their front door to the station, that just, you know, doesn't matter what else the public transport network is doing, they're not even going to get to the station. And I think that is where I'm really, really focusing our efforts. Within new developments. So now we're writing new guidance, requiring developers to assess those walking trips at all times of day, including nights, which is a really, really keen. Assess them within the indicators of the Healthy Streets indicators. Talk about safety, talk about the feelings of safety, use a lot of the GLA guidance on the language there. You know, historically, transport talks about safety in terms of regulation safety, but actually talking about using the language that you've produced about the feelings of safety as barriers. So that's where we're trying to take down those barriers in terms of access to transport. And then there's a wider piece which other people in TfL are doing. We've just published our Equity in Motion document looking at the rest of the transport network and some of the bigger barriers there. I think we all know about those.
Thanks. You mentioned there some of the trips that tend to fall on women more often. For example, the school drop-offs, and sometimes you're talking a nursery, a primary school, a secondary school.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to do those journeys by public transport, and in the London plan, it's very restrictive on parking in new developments. How is that helpful for women and girls?
Well, what we do in transport assessments is making sure that those trips can be accommodated from your new development, so that there is no barriers. So you can do that by active travel or by sustainable travel. You know, we can get into a conversation about whether women can afford cars, etc., etc. But we're enabling, we're making sure that women who are more likely to have those caring responsibilities can do the walk to the nursery, you know, unencumbered with their children, or to school, and that they don't need the car. You know, it's not an essential. So we're very, very focused on active travel and sustainable trips.
So is that happening in London at the moment?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. But for new developments, they're all required to meet the aspirations of the London Plan, T1, the move towards sustainable trips, where possible, where we have a car-free lifestyle that is built in. We're building those opportunities to make those trips sustainably within the design of the building.
And so say if you do have 3 kids all going to 3 different places and you've got to get to work,
yeah,
you think it's entirely possible? Say if you live in outer London, where schools are far away from you, nurseries are far away, that it's entirely possible to
I think
do
there's
that
a wider
them.
issue there about availability of school places, etc., which is not in the remit that I have.
So we're trying to solve the issue before we've got the solution, which is there's not enough school places, not enough nursery places. You can't make those trips by public transport, often in outer London particularly, but we're still going to have no parking on new developments. I think, would you not agree that puts a burden on to women?
No, I don't agree that it puts a burden on women. I think we've got a strategy set out, the Mayor's Transport Strategy, to encourage walking and which is accessible for everybody, well, majority of people. I think, yeah, that's...
We can all wish it to be a goal, and it's an admirable goal, but we've also got to play. I think Susannah's words earlier, we can't build utopia when we have to deal with reality. And I think there's a little bit missed in that answer there, that there's some very obvious concerns here, and to just say, well, we want to be sustainable, but we can't build the utopia without looking at the reality now. So I just saw a hand from Olivia.
Yeah, I wanted to say 2 things about that. I think one is, I think the Superloop is a really kind of great network to kind of connect those more radial journeys that a lot of women who...
To be honest, Olivia, the Superloop, for example, where I live, doesn't come anywhere close. So it sticks within the existing inner London ULEZ and doesn't come out to, for example, where I live in outer London.
Yeah.
So and that would be true for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
That's an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. The second thing I wanted to mention was that I think I really like how you outlined some of the difficulties that there are for women who are like in those more like ages of being a mother or of having these caring responsibilities and moving around. And I think that we also found that for younger women who don't have those same responsibilities, that there are travel differences as well. So a lot of young women, and actually what Susannah was talking about touches on that, will travel further for leisure and will travel further to hang out. So where we worked in Brent, there were a lot of local parks next to where a lot of the young women lived, and there were mugas. There were pitches around there, and none of the women used those green spaces, and instead they congregated a lot more in Queen's Park, because that was seen as it's like a destination park for them, because there's a mixed activities that are going on there, and so they are making much longer journeys, and also the cost of those journeys are more for young women. And there's also things like they were going out of the borough a lot to go to retail spaces, because those are safe spaces that are overseen. It's not necessarily to go shopping, but just to kind of like hang out in a place that has shelter and heating and is overseen. And so I think that there is this real cost on young women that might be more than young men, and that also feeds into like Ubers and things like that. We saw a lot of differences between young women who would either ask for rides when it's a little bit further out of central London, or that would be taking Ubers home, and that within young women there was also, it like exacerbated differences between those who could afford the Uber and those who couldn't. So who is going out and who can't go out that evening, or, yeah.
Sarah, if I could ask you specifically, sorry, was there any more hands that I missed? Did you?
I was just going to say, because it's something we've left out slightly, and it's a one-liner, it's the magnetic pull of Stratford Westfield across all of London. It's where you go as a teenage girl. It's safe. It's got the toilets.
Good toilets.
No, it's so busy that you're not going to be judged for being there or tutted at. And in a way, that's the skate park. But yeah, it's just, we haven't said it out loud, so I just wanted to say that.
Thanks. Sarah, if I could come to you and ask what steps is the Mayor or GLA taking to prioritise accessibility and safety of women in the design of London's transport system?
I'll start off by saying that I don't sit in the London Plan team, so where I'm focused is around the Good Growth by Design programme, so I might not be the best person to be able to speak to this and can probably come back to you. But I can talk a little bit around the kind of inclusive design policies more broadly and what's being done around looking particularly at the kind of Planning for London programme going forward. I think in general terms, obviously London Plan policy does a lot, particularly with regard to the Healthy Streets agenda. And there's a lot of emphasis now on the Planning for London programme and what that means for the next iteration of the London Plan. And we kind of see that, really sort of expect to see building on gender as an issue within the next iteration of the London Plan. Currently there's been a lot of kind of in-depth engagement exercises, both with Londoners and with industry experts, to really try to kind of unpack that. We're also kind of gearing up for the refreshment of the Accessible London LPG, which is now quite out of date, and has a real opportunity to kind of unpack and look. The current Accessible London LPG is quite focused around issues of mobility in particular, and this could really start to kind of unpack a much broader range of issues and attributes that impact access and inclusion to London's built environment, including the transport network.
Thanks, Sarah. What date was that LPG published?
I think it's 2014, but I'd have to check.
Okay, so yeah, 10 years now. So is that something that you think will be? It is being looked at now, and we'll expect to see this year.
It's currently being looked at. I'm not sure what the target date is for refresh. There's the groundwork's currently being kind of laid with a commission that's looking particularly around how we might look to broaden some of the kind of thinking about broadening the emphasis on that away from looking exclusively at issues around mobility to thinking around a wider range of things, including age and things like neurodiversity. So that the groundwork's kind of currently being laid, and some of the thinking to pave the way for that refresh is underway.
Do you think you'd be able to write to the committee after to let us know when we'd expect to see an iteration or draft?
I can go away and investigate, yes.
Thank you. Just to come to the committee, the panel, and ask about perhaps any other ideas for how we could design London's transport system so it's improved for women and girls. Is there any more general points that people would like to make around that? Theo?
I'm just thinking of a study that I've seen in Madrid around safety for women that was implemented around COVID. And this was particularly around the end-to-end journey, as mentioned before. So what they did essentially was to just kind of create the normal sort of journeys that you have with buses, but women could then use the stop sign to kind of point exactly where the bus should stop. And that has really sort of brought about a sense of safety, and it has kind of improved the feeling of safety within Madrid. So I think that's kind of maybe one solution that could be sort of thought about. The other thing is around sort of wintertime journeys and off-peak fares. I think even as myself, as a woman, kind of knowing that your transport is going to be cheaper at a certain time can also motivate you in terms of going out. And then as it gets darker during wintertime, you're also more hesitant in terms of how your transport looks like, what your journeys look like. So I think is exploring how to maybe extend off-peak fares, but I know it's much more of a sort of broader question. But that again, that shapes kind of how you move around the city.
Thank you, Olivia.
Potentially, just kind of more of a case study, and I think probably too radical for London, but there's a part of Ottawa that implemented this bus system where when it's dark you can press to stop the bus. Like the bus can stop between stops, so they continue on their normal route, but they can add stops. And what women experienced from that was that they felt like they weren't going to be followed off the bus because they were choosing their stop, or they knew if someone on the bus felt intimidating to them, and that they were also, I guess, got off the bus somewhere a little bit more convenient, maybe closer to home. Maybe it meant that they could avoid a street that they did want to go down. So I think that's an interesting kind of case study of how we can make our public transport system a little bit more flexible, maybe.
Thanks. And I guess, again, that's probably too wide for us on the planning and regen. We might step on transport toes. But, I mean, there's certainly a way in which we already have hail and rides that works still on more quieter routes. But that's an interesting idea that would work, specifically on night routes where it's less busy. That's a really interesting idea. Can I come back to you, Alison, and ask how TfL reassures itself that the different transport needs for women and girls are accounted for when taking decisions?
I can only speak within planning. As I mentioned before about the equity in motion, where they're building, where that's setting out our 5-year strategy for, or 5-year ambition for inclusive design of transport. And they're going to be creating a centre of excellence on how design excellence for transport. In terms of new developments, as I say, we are doing our research. I mentioned earlier we've we're asking over 1,000 women their attitudes to safety, women and girls, and that's really focusing. That's what's one of the key elements of that is that from the front door element, and that for me it is sort of a key piece to convince others that that's a really important part of the journey. So we've got that in there. I'm going to be using, as I say, the guidance which has come off of this table to go within that. What else is there in the planning side? I know we're looking at things, for instance, we've got a case study at Canning Town. We've done a huge piece of work asking the local women there how they felt about the bus stop and the bus station. And then the second stage, which we've just been procuring, and I sat on the panel as women's safety, using one of the recommendations out of your guidance with having a gender lead, where we're going to put together, so we've got the information that's come out of the women and girls research, but we're also going to now bring in the transport engineering, so which is sort of a new element for us, where we've got this, combining the two, we've got all this work and coming up with a co-design of a station when you're considering all the operational impacts as well. We've got to run the buses, we've got to be, there's so much safety requirements there, we can't have a free-for-all, but yeah, so that's going to be a really interesting piece, and then we're going to take that through into, we talked about looking at how we fund that, looking maybe how we adapt with sort of piloting some of the things about how we carry that forward to implementation, so that will be a really interesting piece, and hopefully that will shape, that's come out of one of the VOG strategy commitments, so using that, we'll hopefully use that as a pilot, and then that will set some of the standards for this Centre of Excellence. But yeah.
Thanks. And do you collect this aggregated data on women's travel patterns, taking into account costs and caring responsibilities?
I would need to check with the data team on that one. But yeah, I can send something back in for you.
Yeah, if there's data that's available, if you could let us know.
Yeah, I'll check with them.
And then my final kind of question, it's probably going to be more than one question, one area, in regards to TfL, Alison, is on station car park developments, and the fact that these obviously take away a car park for women who are using the train, sometimes, very often, shift workers. This is a lot of the complaints we've had, especially in outer London. People use these as park and rides, which I know Assembly Member Berry has been in favour of as well previously. And where we're losing that car parking space, what is the effect on women's safety?
I believe they're being put forward by the development arm of Transport for London. I can't speak because I assess planning applications.
TfL have to give them the lease over to develop their car
Yeah,
park.
but because I assess planning applications and they're putting the planning application in, there's sort of a distinction between the two. In terms of that, I can ask for a position from them.
In your role as someone you want to design spaces that are safe for women, though, can you see that the benefit of having secure, well-lit parking next to tube stations, which allow women and girls to come home at all times of the night, be that working or be that being out with friends, and have a secure place they can go to and get their car? Which also encourages the public transport use as well, because be there not that option, they may not have been able to take the train at all.
Being able to drive to stations. The removal of car parking and having development at stations is supported by the London Plan. So if I was assessing a planning application, that would be supported. In terms of how I assess that in women's travel, in women's safety, I would be looking at the onward, looking at that development, that housing development, and if those women could get around, it would have to be within a planning application. It would have, where would it have the pros and cons of those using the, it would probably have to go through their EQIA on that, but I don't know. That's the area when they put forward a site.
So, for example, especially in North East London, we've got two major hospitals, Whipps Cross and North Middlesex, and a lot of, particularly women, often in medical roles there, are getting the tube out from the stations because they can't park at the hospital; it's very expensive. To their stations, either in outer Enfield or in places like Woodford, things like that, out from the hospitals. And if they, for example, lost that, and I know in Enfield that they are threatened with losing their car parking space, what is the impact on them? What should they do to feel safe? Because they report that makes them feel safe, that they know they can come back, be it 12 o'clock at night, 6 a.m. in the morning, 10 o'clock at night, all these really unsociable hours, and they get straight in their car and they feel safe. What can they do when they lose that space? Or how can they flag to you that they feel to TfL and have a
hypothetical new hospital, because we're only talking about planning, we're not in the transport. So we've got this new hospital and it's reducing its car parking. So I would be enabling women to travel by active travel as much as possible and sustainable travel, and looking at the barriers for that rather than not addressing those barriers and continuing to drive.
Do you understand? But we're talking about outer London. It's a really big part of London. It's not got the same. You might live 2 miles from a train station, for example. So in terms of coming back at 3 o'clock in the morning, there's only so much we can ever do to make people feel safe to walk 2 miles at that time of the morning. They're probably going to want to get in the car, and when TfL takes away the station car parks, that has an impact on the safety that women and girls feel.
I don't think I can comment on that, to be honest.
So what would be the kind of counter argument to what I've said? What do you think makes them feel safe about not having a secure place to park and having to potentially walk 2 miles home?
All I would say, the removal of car parking and the aspiration that we move away from car parking with car usage within London is something that's set out within policy and strategy, and we will be applying London Plan policy.
But do you realise the pitfalls of that in outer London? That's a great policy for inner London. It's a great policy for central London.
That's a policy that's been adopted and has gone through. It's gone through all its examination in public, and that was chosen as the right thing to do for London.
Might I make a suggestion, sending my best? It sounds like the question that you're posing is, does the reduced quantity of car parking spaces make women and girls, or particularly working women, feel less safe? And that's a question that I think speaks to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the need for wider data collection on this. So I think it's an important and relevant question, to which I think Alison's made clear she doesn't have the data in front of her to answer whether the answer is yes or no, but it's a question that does need answering. And so I think what we'd want from the committee to think about where we could get that answer from.
Thank you. I wasn't going to ask anymore, but I think the arguments are obvious, to be honest. We know for a fact that women feel less safe when they have their car parking spaces taken away.
Thank you, Assemblyman Best. We have a final question in this section from Assemblyman Berry, and then we will break for 5 minutes. So over to yourself.
Sure. So the little follow-up I wanted to do, and it's probably slightly takes the place of my final question, although I'll chuck in a quick question about data at the end. It was about cycling, and we haven't really covered that yet. And I was really impressed and shocked by the findings, but really impressed by the work that was done by London Cycling Campaign recently, a big survey of women and what makes them feel safe to cycle. And it's all the different issues that have been brought up today. A lot of it's to do with cycling infrastructure, which is mainly to the sort of thing we'll bring up in Transport Committee, but certainly a lot of people talked about being made to feel unwelcome in the space, being abused. 9 out of 10 had experienced abuse while cycling, nearly 2/3 in the last month. So it's really, really common. And the most common thing that's said to women, according to this research, is get off the road. Basically, you're not welcome here. This is not a space for you. And I think that is something that really does need to be dealt with. There are many more women trying to cycle. Now, one of the recommendations from London Cycling Campaign was, on planning terms, for Transport for London to include social safety as a key priority in its cycling route quality criteria, and to work with the design advocates and get design review panels to look at infrastructure with women and women's safety in mind as well. So those are two things that really do speak to what's going on in this committee. The other thing that's going on is that they are starting to do more orbital cycle routes, and the cycling infrastructure has suffered from what almost all transport infrastructure suffers from, which is only having routes that are radial into the places where people go to work. That's very male-centred planning, and so the more orbital routes that we talked about for buses are coming in for cycling as well. So I wanted to ask if TfL could comment on the recommendations that Maurice looked at in terms of social safety being built into cycling routes, in terms of being well lit and available year round, and making it a little bit clearer that women are welcome there, but also anyone else wants to comment on any of those issues too.
Well, I'll definitely ask the cycling team for that response, because that's a really interesting point. I know within the women's safety audits, which we're doing as part of the VULG strategy, I think we've got 6 locations across London where we're asking women, and that project's very much how you ask women. The outcome of it is a useful byproduct of this understanding how we engage as TfL engages with women to do things like what you're saying, when we build our infrastructure, how do we actually go out and consult them and get useful impact. One of those sites out of the 5 or 6 locations is about cycling, and is about asking women on the routes how you feel, what makes us safe, how do you ask particularly when women are going through a route, what makes it safe, what makes it not. So first of all, we're trying to work out how you reach those women, and then what's the questions to ask and how to ask them without touching on some particularly triggering episodes that they might have had. But then hopefully we're going to get some interventions. But so that's the one that I'm aware of, that where we are actively thinking, right, we need more engagement here, we need to be thinking about safety. How do we do that? Well, first of all, how do we ask? But I can ask the cycling team, because I think that's a really important topic.
Yeah, if you can, I'm trying not to prolong the meeting too long, but if you can get any written evidence you have.
I don't design the cycle routes. As I say before, I'm very much about the built environment and the new planning applications that are coming through and the application of the London Plan. But so I can ask the people that do that to get for more information.
Great, thank you. And did I see Susannah? You put your hand up just there.
I'll be very quick because we all want to break. Two things. I think there's some very specific work come up around greenways, because Marina was talking about before, this sense of women want escape and routes. It's like the canal path. You've got no way off. You're trapped. If somebody gets in your way or knocks you off,
there is a specific incident, and that's kind of route laid out in the report, actually.
There was a horrible one in Dublin a while back as well. But that really, that sort of sense. The other thing I'd say is it chimes in with something, because teenage girls are not particularly good on cycling. They see it as something for boys. And again, it's very location specific. But we also need to be talking to the ones who are not cycling. Because we talk to girl skateboarders, and that's a tiny percent of the ones who skate. They're the ones that have survived to get that far. So many give up or don't even try, and we need to be finding out what the barriers are for the ones who are not doing it, as well as the ones, how can we get the girls to take it up at age 11 and stick with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And by its nature, the survey that London Cycling Campaign did was of its members who were cyclists. Great, I think that might be all we've got time for.
Yes, I think so. We are going to have a 5 minutes. I do want to just, because I think transport was such, how can I put this? It's probably the area of our governance where we've begun to see the most forefront thinking around sort of gender-lensed design of that infrastructure. So I did want to cycle back and just give, before we close this particular section, an opportunity to anyone in the panel who wanted to tease out any of the aspects that they wanted to highlight that we've discussed. I know, for instance, we talked about some really innovative examples of like core care master planning areas that allowed us to think, I think we were talking about Bogota, for instance, really innovatively about how we reshape the infrastructure and design of our areas with transport in mind that might even shift the way that we think about gender responsibilities and caring duties. So no worries if not, but if anyone did want to draw out any particular themes around the transport and redesign of our infrastructure that we've talked about before we close, here's a moment to do so.
Chair, also, there is the question about if there are gaps in data collection and how we improve data collection that I didn't ask because I went on to cycling instead.
And I think naturally that leaves the question as well as if, we needed to think more about that. Where would we data collect? What would be the questions that we asked? So is there anyone on the panel who wanted to respond to that? But I can appreciate you might want to break instead.
Or you could write to us.
I've asked the panel if they'd like to respond. If not, that's fine. We'll have a break and we can always follow up any specific things in writing. Okay, perfect. Let's take a break, I think, because it's been a long session, and we'll come back, I think maximum by, I think we're going to go for 12:12. So that gives us 7 minutes. So nip to the loo, get coffee, we'll be back and we'll continue this conversation then. Thank you. Hello, welcome back. I hope everyone had a sort of like good sort of brain refresher in that break. We've got about 45 minutes left, and I think it was sort of being how can I put this? I felt like the discussions we've had up until now were the more substantive, sort of meaty aspects of the conversation that we wanted to have. And I sort of see a lot of what we've got coming next as almost summary questions. So I'm going to combine a couple of mine to make sure that we do stick to time. And there are some that I think are actually appropriate to be followed up in writing. So regarding the London plan specifically, because Sarah, I know you're here from the Good Growth team, but like you said, you don't sit in the London plan team. So I'll identify those. So the first sort of broad question is what more needs to be done to ensure the next London plan addresses gender bias in the built environment? So this is a question to everyone. And essentially what this is saying is, the London plan at the moment in sort of the incoming year is being reviewed. We're looking at how we address a new London plan. What is it that we can do to ensure gender bias is integrated in the lens that we use to design the built environment? And I think to that end, Assemblyman Baker made a good point. The question that we sort of left on is really important, which is around data collection. So how could data collecting be improved to inform gender-informed planning decisions? I think that question goes hand in hand in terms of what policies you'd want. So what data do we need, and how will that inform? Or, what data do we need and what policies do we need? Because I think that's chicken and egg in terms of how you ensure it happens. So I don't know who wants to go first, but I think this is probably an all-panel question. Yeah, Susannah, thank you.
I'm going to start because actually it's less my area and it's probably more useful if I'm general at the beginning. I think the danger with plans, and it's almost inevitable, is it's really easy to write a high-level inclusive plan that goes, everything is going to be equal for everybody. The real problems is actually getting that enacted in in detail. It's in the nitty-gritty detail of writing supplementary planning guidance, of writing strategies, of actually evaluating things where that happens. And it's so, like I said, it's really easy to just go, yeah, everything's lovely. And I think one of the key ways of improving things is sharing good practice. A couple of examples of London. Hackney have done really good supplementary planning guidance on child-friendly spaces, which goes right up to teenagers. Tower Hamlets are producing an evidence base for their local plan, which includes a massive paper on gender equity. So sharing, but equally, it's just like not saying, from our case, just not going, facilities for teenagers, such as Moogers and skate parks. It's about giving examples of how to do it, to make it easier for people to do those much more nitty-gritty details. Data, genuinely, really anything at this stage. There's so little sex disaggregated data generally. But I also, just to go back to the Equality Act, it's worth noting that to do a proper Equalities impact assessment, you need data. And there is case law, and please don't ask me, I'm not a lawyer, please go and speak to your legal department, which sets out that if you don't have the data, you have a duty to collect it. So the data isn't there, isn't an excuse. So again, being rigorous with the Equality Act, with Equalities impact assessments, is going to be really key to actually inflecting the high-level policy so that it makes a difference.
Thank you, Susannah. That was really helpful. Can I be and ask for some specifics? What data specifically, and how do you think we can improve that collection?
From our perspective, in terms of girls and public spaces, the only data that exists on who uses teenage facilities was us getting people to go and stand in the park this year. We don't know anything at all. I can point you to research studies from Sweden, I can point you to research studies from America. There is just a huge basic research gap. So, but as I think I've said before, post-occupancy data is really important. So that if you build something, let's find out who uses it. And I think the TfL development guidelines do include that. There is a requirement for post-occupancy data collection after a development, which is really good. But that, for me, is let's try some things out, let's collect that data. But just anything, just doing anything on a data basis rather than just going, a Mooger, I quite fancy a skate park, it's cool, the cool boy skateboard. Just using any data at all would be a bonus from where I'm standing.
Okay, thank you. Was that an indication, Theo?
Yeah, also sort of on that broad level, I feel like sort of the London plan does mention engagement, but it doesn't sort of go into detail of what type of engagement. And yeah, Susannah mentioned sort of post-occupancy, but I think there's also room to create sort of a pre-occupancy type of evaluation of sort of building structures, etc., asking people sort of what they want, or, you know, when you are dealing with an existing building, for instance, that's going to be later on sort of repaired or sort of rebuilt or retrofit, etc., is asking what existing spaces are lacking, etc. So I think there's room within that. I think qualitative data is going to be quite important to get. So that's qualitative data from, you know, ranging from surveys then to kind of even sort of emotional mapping, for instance, or doing sort of those walks in the park. So there's sort of a broad range that could be done, but this is only done when you have that constant engagement with communities and you do take that time of blocking aside sort of engaging with them from the beginning all the way to the end, and that's how you kind of integrate that into the design process and then see through of what sort of the gaps are. So I think in terms of qualitative data, that's where we could sort of improve.
Thank you, Theo. I've got Olivia, then Marina.
Yeah, just following up on what Ty is saying, I completely agree. I think there's collecting data once something has been already built or implemented, and then there's also collecting that data beforehand. I think that was very clear to us in our research when we were working in Clapham, and some young women were living on this development, and they were describing to us, we asked them the question of like, okay, well, we've worked together for multiple weeks. What would you like to see in your local area? What's an innovation, based on your experiences and all that? And when we asked them, it could have been something, as imaginative and crazy as a water slide, but one of the young women proposed an armrest, it was a little wall that they were using to hang out. It was like a very low wall that you could sit on, and that was just a space that her and her friends hung out at, and she was saying that actually it'd be kind of comfy if we also had an armrest. So I think if you do study how people are experiencing their spaces, how they are already using their spaces, we do need to actually gather that data about like, okay, well, what are you making use of? And sometimes it's not going to be something that's incredibly innovative that is going to work better for a community. It's going to be something that is a simple change to something that already exists. But we need to know how people are using what already exists to know then how to address issues for that group.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. And Marina?
So I'm a policy planner, so probably kind of like I can give some a little bit more concrete examples, and I'll be talking on the example of LLDC, where just sharing knowledge and saying the things where they can actually impact. Before we come to policy and planning, it's very, very important, because it's a complex topic, that we start changing make organizational changes. And what I mean by this, and how we did it at LLDC and worked wonders, is that so we mentioned gender budgeting, gender sensitive procurement. So there are many things that need to change until we come to actually support the planning from that strategic level. So let's say council strategies, they need to address and be committed to gender inclusive urban design and planning and gender mainstreaming in its broader sense. And so we organize at LLDC project board, so that is everyone from every department comes there and sits, so that helps us to reuse resources. So study or experience from one project can really nicely feed into any other project that is relevant. The other thing is, I mentioned stakeholders group, because a lot of information that you will be gathering is going to be beyond your remit, so you need to have those partnerships. So stakeholders group, really important. Again, that needs to happen before we come to planning. Evidence-based gathering, huge topic. The way how you can gather evidence, there are a variety of methodologies. Susannah mentioned Tower Hamlets. We also did our evidence-based gathering. Based on that, Tower Hamlets employed a person dedicated to doing this, and I think they did quite a great job. And I think we can use that example for, let's say, all of the boroughs. They can go and gather evidence base. Evidence-based gathering we do for inform every policy. So we do for open spaces to know how many open spaces we need. So equally, we need to do the same. Now, there is a difference in terms of the data gathering, and there are multiple stages. We cannot see just like as one stage and then we understand everything. And there is also like a loop between. So the order of things could be, let's say, organizational level. In this case, let's talk about LLDC. We gather evidence base for the whole area, engaging with women and girls, asking what good feels like, what do you want, what are your aspirations, where bad looks like, what that is, trying to really tease out and understand what are the issues, but also aspirations of local women and girls. So now we use that evidence base to inform every strategy, every project, every policy. But it's very important that, that gives you an idea of some of the issues, but not all of the issues, because it's very contextual. We were also talking about that every community is going to have different needs, and every project is going to be sitting in a different context. So what we are proposing is that, within obviously the handbook that we are preparing, is that at every major development needs to do the same. So they need to engage and bring women and girls and their lived experiences from the very early design stage. So that is a second stage of data gathering. And we want to receive that information back so that we use the knowledge that they are collecting to inform, again, going back to the top, inform our understanding broader. And then post-occupancy evaluation, extremely crucial. Again, once you understand, gather that data, you then feed to that organizational level, and then you revise your processes, you revise your strategies, your SPDs, or whatever it is that you use to prepare. And just going back on, in also like another thing that we need to really be mindful, and the importance of having a clear policy or strategy or the guidance, is that if gender-sensitive urban design and planning is not a requirement within the project brief, that's it. Like, we lost opportunity. By the time we come to committee, by the time we come to the officer can only do as much as following the policies, and developer would come with already, prepared brief. Their design team is going to be working months before they see planning officer. So if it's not built into the brief, it is not going to happen. And that's why I think like a very clear strategy that what we are requiring is engaging women and girls needs to be set somewhere clearly, so the developers, before they come to talk to us planning authorities, they know what they have to do. Toolkits for how to engage, much welcome. We are preparing one. Just an example, how can you successfully engage your community?
That was so helpful, Marina. Thank you. And I think for me, I just want to reiterate the sort of question I have before me, which is what more needs to be done to ensure that the next London plan addresses gender bias in the built environment, which also speaks to another question: what steps has the GLA taken to ensure gender perspectives will be incorporated in the next London plan? I really think we come back to the same thing, which is data collection. And I think one key recommendation that's coming, I think, from this particular committee meeting is actually for the next London plan to have, deeper sort of the lens that we've discussed in terms of gender mainstreaming or resolving gender bias, is coming up with really constructive ways that we have that data collection, because I think we've identified actually the key questions from the panel. I think they've been really substantial, and I've really enjoyed understanding the spectrum of safety as well that we've talked about. But I'm yet really to get a sense of how we get that data. Theo, and then Olivia.
Just while Marina, you were speaking, I just thought of just an exercise that we are planning to kind of implement within Atkins, which is to ask practitioners themselves what sort of gaps are, or what the barriers are to really sort of implementing spaces that are sort of gender mainstreamed. Because as a designer yourself, you probably have sort of ways of approaching design that you sort of may be dealing with constantly. So to also kind of flip that question back to practitioners to see what gaps are. I think there's also opportunities, as Marina mentioned, to work with stakeholders such as schools and also third spaces where a lot of youth would spend time in. So, for example, in Whitechapel idea centers or libraries, etc. Because there's room in shaping that. So I think, to reach out to those third spaces, but then, also flipping back to practitioners would be a good way to approach data collection.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Theo. Olivia.
Yeah, it was just to say that data collection is also not neutral, and that there are biases that are embedded in the ways that we do collect data. So one of the things that we were trying to do at LSE was to hire young people as young researchers, as peer researchers, and have them have ownership over that data and be the ones who collect that data and experience, and then we do translate that data into something that worked, for example, for a developer or for, you know, peer-reviewed journals. But I think it's like that who is doing the data collection is also going to be a really important question.
Thank you very much. I agree with that. Susannah?
I think, and one of the things that's clear from what I've been saying, is we are getting somewhere with the qualitative data, with the engagement, and that's, you know, it is always very place-specific, and we need to aggregate it, and we need to look at patterns within it, but that is starting to be there. I think a really simple requirement in the plan, simply that data is collected. So, for example, to go back to my playing pitch strategies, Sport England requires a massive amount of data from a council before they will fund the pitches. Now, as it's turned out, and we are talking to Sport England about this because they're slightly embarrassed, they've collected all this sex-aggregated data accidentally. They just haven't analysed it. So we're hoping that one of the things that's will be part of their next playing pitch strategy document will be, you have to collect sex-disaggregated data and analyse it. Let's just make everybody do this.
Yeah.
As, you know, at a really basic level. If you are doing anything, we require that you give us the data that forms the backdrop to this.
No, I think that's fascinating because it goes beyond the London plan then, doesn't it? It's like, what can the GLA do as a convening body in London? Sort of speaking to Theo's point as well about using our relationship with key stakeholders and practitioners to say, actually, if you've got some of this data, analyse it. If you don't have some of this data, collect it. Thank you. Marina, then Sarah, and then I think yeah.
I mean, just one of the processes, because we're thinking about that, like how can you get all of the data that someone else is as well collecting, because that is really helping you to broaden your knowledge. Apart from a stakeholders group, which I mentioned and we spoke, is very helpful. One of the requirements, it's a handbook, it's not a requirement per se, but a suggestion to our developers that we are saying is that once you do engagement, collect gender disaggregated data, analyze, you kind of like need to provide a document, and then we provide the guidance what that document should look like, so that that data is passed back on to us, because for them it is going to be relevant for their own development, but it will be wealth of knowledge there that is that we can use on the strategic level that goes way beyond their red side boundary, and it's just kind of like a really being smart. How can you use the planning powers and the planning tools, and I think we can do that, to request that that data is fed back. Now, obviously, for that to happen, you also on that strategic level, which I spoke before, need to have system in processes. And I mean, I know, for example, that GLA has an amazing data team, and it's incredible what data they have, and they're very skilled. So potential also to explore how do you store data, who manages, and how do you get developers to actually feed back to you and the stakeholders.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in kind of building on the point that Marina was making around, policy in isolation, and that it's really important that it kind of sits within a wider landscape of measures, and I thought it might be helpful just to give a bit of a readout from some of the recommendations that we pulled from the piece of research we did, which we originally was quite outward facing about what the sector should be doing and what developers should be doing, and designers should be doing, and people undertaking engagement exercises should be doing. And I think there was a bit of a reflection that we also needed to kind of look inwards a little bit as well. So we're starting to kind of look towards how we can do a bit of kind of capacity building within the GLA group, so that we're really well skilled up as an organisation to take this on, and potentially even some training with the designing out crime officers that speak to the secure by design world of work, so that there's a bit more kind of overlap and joint understanding there, that there's a bit more attention given to this kind of convening role, and that there could even be some benefit in really bringing together all of the actors that are currently in this space, that we'd be a bit more focused on projects where we're actually on the mayor's land or using the mayor's funding, and really kind of driving the principles there as well. But also that, of course, policy is a really huge part of that as well, and the Planning for London programme, the way it's being designed, is very kind of inclusive, and there's been a lot of emphasis so far on inclusive policy areas, but that's kind of ongoing, and I think there's some commitment from the London Plan team to really kind of drill down into gender through the process.
Well, that's reassuring to hear, Sarah. Thank you. And my other questions, I think, regarding the London Plan, but I do actually think these are things that we can follow up in writing, and to some extent I think you have already addressed. So, for instance, we've got a question here on the London Plan guidance on access and inclusion, when this will be brought forward, how this will support inclusive design for women and girls. I think we've spoken about that already earlier in this meeting. I think it's only best asked questions regarding that. And then we also had a question on the consultation around the draft LPG on housing designs that was published in February 2022, which initially included a reference, I think, on safety to women and girls in public, but then the LPG published in June 2023 did not include this reference. So I can appreciate that you might not be well placed to answer why, because you're not in the London Plan team, but if you did want to speak to that, please do.
I think that's probably something to take away.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think the committee will follow up, probably specifically with the London Plan team, in writing around that. I'm keen to keep us moving. My next question, my aggregated questions, I think actually have been covered, which I think the core of that is what more can be done to engage women and girls and more marginalised groups within the Planning for London programme and the wider kind of planning process. I think that's been covered quite substantially, but if there are additional comments, please do flag that now, panel. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's been covered. So I think the final question, Assemblyman Best, I think you feel like this has been answered already by what I can see. I mean, I think Sarah was talking about the collaboration between TfL, LLDC and GLA, but if you'll indulge me, I think that the specific part remaining is, do you see, I know you said you want to see more collaboration, Sarah, but do you want to see that kind of turning into a single accessible piece of work stream that might result in a kind of gender-informed planning piece of guidance that sits across the three? With the LLDC phasing out, I can see why that might not be the case, but certainly between TfL and the GLA.
As Alison just helpfully whispered in my ear, of course there's the VOG strategy that sits across the piece, but I think, you know, where we in our team have been quite focused on that partnership, particularly between LLDC, the Places for London commercial arm of TfL, and our housing and land colleagues at the GLA, has been about really the kind of potential to use developments that's on the ground and happening to test these principles in practice. So that's so far been the kind of emphasis around that really sort of collaborative way of working.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to now move on to the National Guidance and Intervention section. For this, I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry. It's a bit of a frog in my throat today. So we've obviously been focused on asking about the London Plan and the GLA, and although we've made reference to various things outside London, various schemes outside London, but obviously there is national planning processes, and so I'd just like to open it to the entire panel. If you have any views on how gender considerations are integrated into the national urban planning processes, and whether there are any challenges in building what we've all been discussing, or limitations in the current guidance and legislation. Susannah.
I've alluded to both of these before. It's not just about planning. It's about looking at the wider system of what feeds into planning. So which I think the Sport England is a peculiar body in that it has lots of different heads. Yeah. And I think the planning aspect of how they respond to pitches and how they respond to planning applications is something that really does need to be considered through a gender lens. I think there are specific pieces of guidance like the Field and Trust guidance, which they apparently are revising and have been revising for quite a long time, and I'd really like them to revise it, which needs to be really looked at through a gender lens. And it's guidance, but my goodness, it's written into every single piece of planning in the country. So it's looking at that whole system surrounding what feeds into the planning application is, I think, the work that really needs doing, that will then change the planning landscape.
That's enormous, isn't it? That's enormous. Is there any way of the planning system sort of ensuring that all the many organisations that feed into that process there should be some sort of quality control to say, well, have they looked at this aspect or not? I'm just trying to sort of work out how
we are the annoying thorn in their side that makes them do it. But I think no, actually, it's not that difficult because it goes back to the same old thing. They need to collect the data so that they know that they are doing it right, and they need then to do a decent equalities impact assessment. So I've been reading all of these pitches reports which tell me very clearly, when you look at the evidence, that 90% of the users of pitches are men and boys. And then somebody does an equalities impact assessment that goes, maybe we need a few changing rooms that work better for the ladies. And I'm like, are we missing something here? So it's creating processes, which I actually don't think is that difficult. It's a big ask, but you can just say to everyone, if you want public money, you need to follow this process. We've got it in the law. Let's just make sure that it's done. And actually, as well as I've talked about creating good practice of guidance, a piece of work I would love to be done would be somebody creating really thorough template equalities impact assessments for a whole range of stuff that give people the trigger questions so that they're not just doing it on a tick box that I've done that. I will tell you the worst one I've ever seen was for a skate park, and all it said was disabled people can get on the bottom right-hand corner.
That's quite impressive. I've seen some terrible equality impact assessments in my time as well, but that does take the biscuit somewhat. Does anyone else have any views on that, how we can build that in? Thanks, Anne.
From the transport perspective, when I am considering the MPPF and the wider guidance, there seems to be quite rightly there's a focus on highway safety, and I think most transport professionals are aware of that. There isn't a support for sustainable development, but from my point of view, the discussion around pedestrian safety and this language of the feeling of safety and the perception of safety could be strengthened, so it can, I'm not say compete because we don't want to compete against modes, but it can be considered in that context. I think that would be useful, and where I think London is benefiting, is having that language and starting that conversation when a development comes forward, which is maybe not so prominent within the national guidance.
No, I think that's really interesting, and they are often, that sort of physical safety and then personal safety is often set against each other, and then one is deprioritised. Do you think there's a gender aspect in that? Because women tend to, not a leading question or anything like that, but women, as we've heard, are more likely to perceive there as a safety risk. And do you think there's a reason that that's deprioritised?
There's I think that is I think that's probably more about the hierarchy where it's been developed from and the historic hierarchy. But unfortunately,
it's also very much easier to measure if physical injuries are much easier to measure than perception. Susannah.
Very quick thing, actually, something developers tell us as well, is actually making it a requirement. Biodiversity net gain, they've all got to do it now. They say, we want the equivalent of, what is it? Gender equality net gain. If you can make it something that they are required to deliver, they really want to do it.
Thanks. Anyone else?
I think on that note, it was, definitely, I think with the accountability aspect to really have that as a requirement. I think public spending has generally declined, but to have that set in generally as a requirement that if you are going to get that money, you should invest in that. I was just going to mention town centre regeneration strategies as something that should include youth and young people. I think Olivia has done quite a bit of work around crew, and that sort of decline of the town centre has had a huge impact on young women within that space. So I think also expanding that and not only looking at green spaces, public realms, but the entire sort of town centre regeneration as an aspect should be included.
Thanks. And very specifically, I think, are there asks that you would make of the government to ensure that the needs of women and girls are reflected in the built environment? I think some of these are actually requests there. Is there anything you'd like to add to that in terms of the national processes and where money is given? That's absolutely fine. No worries. Okay, and back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Baker. So we have spud ahead. It's lunchtime. Yeah, it's lunchtime. I want a jacket potato. I can't lie to you. We've sped ahead, and we've got time to spare. I've got 2 more questions. One of which I think has already been answered, but actually, I might flip it and end on that question, because I think it could be a nice way to close the framing of this conversation. So there are 2. So there's one about successful case studies or pilot projects related to gender-informed planning, either in the UK or globally, that London can learn from. And that's probably the note I'd like to end on. So I'll reverse and ask this question instead, which is, firstly, the UK is a signatory to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 5 is to achieve gender equality and empower women and girls. Addressing the progress against this goal, the government's 2019 review made no reference to gender bias in the built environment. So this comes off the back of some of the questioning from Senator Baker around what we need at a national level. Do you think the issues we've discussed today around gender and the built environment should be referenced in the government's next review of the Sustainable Development Goals? And, part of that question is also, how do we move into kind of assessing and measuring gender mainstreaming globally? I would maybe say to this piece of paper in front of me, maybe we need to focus on London for the moment, because we don't seem to have data collection here. So I think basically that I'm just going to throw out some big holistic questions, which is, globally, do we want to see better measuring of the UN Sustainable Development Goals from the UK government in the context of putting gender planning in its review of how we meet that goals? And then subsequently, if there's any good case studies that you want to leave us on that can make us feel positive and inspired to keep pushing this agenda here in London. Yeah, Theo.
I'm just going to comment, just from working with sort of UN bodies. I think the UK could do slightly even better than just to kind of meet those goals, is to actually inform how those goals are written and how those goals are instituted, because we all know that the SDGs can be quite ambiguous. They have sort of vague language in how they're addressing challenges. So I think by starting to do this work, the UK could actually lead into that. I also think, in terms of measuring, I think the difficulty that I'm finding, I think in some of the work, is that there isn't necessarily one success factor in terms of how public space can be addressed to cater to young people. So I think to start to kind of develop some of that data and to start sort of gathering maybe a database of case studies could then sort of contribute to how to measure a successful sort of space that caters to young people. In terms of case studies, I think the Bogota one is the one that probably resonates with me the most, because it's a metropolitan scale sort of policy, and it works super well, and the beneficiaries are really sort of finding sort of positive outcomes out of this. But I'm just going to leave that.
I've mentioned most of this before, but like I said, Vienna, the manual for gender mainstreaming in Vienna is incredibly comprehensive. It's I think one of the things we need to be doing is not reinventing the wheel, but just continually building on what's been done. As a place to go and visit and look at a really, like I said, Umea, that it's around how you book a pitch. How do we make this subway better? It's a really holistic policy, and I think what they're doing is really interesting. But also, I think sometimes it can be really small details that make a difference. It's brilliant to have, the Bogota stuff is fantastic and I want to know more about it. But it's as simple as, really something, teenage girls want to face each other when they sit. All of our benches are straight. It's something that they see as a mild microaggression against them, as another sign they're not welcome. So just something as simple as Park in Bath that we talked to, they've just gone and put some semicircular benches in. Hurrah, everyone's happy. It was really cheap. But that, sometimes success isn't a huge thing that can be massively measured. It's just an endless series of tiny decisions that together add up to a much bigger space.
I think that's really well put, Susannah. Thank you. Marina.
We mentioned a couple of times processes, and I think they're very, very important, particularly when we're talking on the city level and on the level where, it's not just kind of like looking at the project and 100%, what is the result of every design process is important, but the process needs to support that. And I would really, really love anyone who is interested in this topic to look at the City Alliance, which is UN Ops agency that is specifically and exclusively doing this. It is helping cities, although this is within the Global South, to become gender sensitive and gender mainstream. And they're talking about the processes. So they're talking what is needed to happen before we come to this, like a delivery stage on the city level, on the larger scale level, to actually then we ensure that these processes are embedded, because that is the only way we can. So maybe measures to success is actually, are you having processes in place? And again, City Alliance only does that. Fantastic people. I actually spoke to them because I came across the document and I said, there's nothing more. I can not reinvent the wheel. So I called them and I said, can I just copy this? Can I just use this? Because I have nothing to add. And they were like, yes, of course. That's why we are here. And yeah, it goes back to, there are some things out there that really, really work. And the other thing apart from the processes, the other thing that they do is participatory assessment, which is embedded in everything they do. And this is the solution. So participatory assessment has to be embedded. Processes need to support that. And that's been done across the globe. And yeah, it's nothing new.
Thank you, Marina. Any other closing comment? And this is, I think, the opportunity now for any closing comments from the panellists. Otherwise, we'll draw the discussion to an end. But anything you want to leave us with, food for thought, please, Sarah.
Just a quick thought. There's been loads of best practice examples from the panel international, and I think that's fab. And of course, there's loads of amazing practice on the panel itself as well. But I just wanted to flag that there's also some really good examples in London of really great work that's happening. And I think of Build Up, who do a lot of kind of construction projects with young people, and there's some focus on gender there as well, and even in the boroughs as well with Southwark and their women's safety charter, or Croydon Living Streets and the work that they've done around bringing gender and young teenage girls into the process of looking at that. So there's a lot to learn from elsewhere, but there's also some positivity closer to home as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's exactly it. We want best practice, whether it's in London already that we can replicate, or if it's elsewhere in the UK, or it's global. So I think if one humble request to the panel, if they could send any best practice that they think that the committee should be looking at, that we can integrate into our output from this committee meeting and integrate into recommendations, we'd be really keen to hear about it. Right, I think it's a wrap, folks. I think that's all the questions we have from our end, unless there's anything burning from the committee members that they want to follow up with the panel on. If you don't mind, I'd ask you to just kindly stay seated just for a couple of minutes whilst we finish a couple of items of business. And if the committee members will indulge me, I'd love a group photo afterwards, because this is the beautiful all-women panel, all-women committee today that I just want to capture the moment of, especially being our last committee meeting of the term. Okay, where are we now? So I've got thank you very much to the guests for their responses. I mean, yeah, thank you doesn't even begin to cover it. I'm always overwhelmed by the level of expertise that the guests on Planning Regeneration Committee meeting bring. So much food for thought, whether that's about best practice elsewhere or just the lens that we need to think about how we design. I think this particular municipal year we've been really keen to take that kind of step back approach in anticipation for a new London plan incoming, to say, really, sometimes rather than sort of thinking about small policies, if you had a blank piece of paper, how would you design a city that's inclusive for everyone and gives everyone the opportunity to thrive? So I think you've been an integral part of helping shape that conversation for us, and that will feed deeply into the output that we will be collating before PERDA. So thank you very much for your expertise and your time today, and please stay in touch with the committee members individually and the committee more broadly. Where can I ask the committee to note the report and discussion? Thank you. Oh God, could you imagine if I get emotional and start crying now? Last committee meeting. And I'll be like, pull yourself together and go get a jacket potato. It's going to be in the transcript, that is. Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Great. Wonderful. So as I say, sort of the date of the next meeting, which, you know, the London Assembly's annual meeting due to take place in May 2024, will decide which committees to establish for the 2024-2025 Assembly year, and a timetable of meetings of these committees, which will basically be after the election. So I'm hoping my fellow members will be back here. I'm hoping I'll be back here.
Can you hope that?
I'm hoping that as chair. I'm and just to say also, you know, just appreciate that, you know, there are other Assembly members that have been a really key part of forming the committee's agenda and institutional knowledge. So Assembly Member Boff, who's been a really big asset to this committee, Assembly Member Fortune, the Deputy Chairman, who's sent his apologies today, but, you know, Assembly Member Baker, Assembly Member Best, Assembly Member Berry, it's been a pleasure working with you. The Secretariat has been a pleasure working with you. I found this to be an incredibly productive committee. So thank you so much for, giving me the opportunity to chair it for the last 2 years and work so productively with you all. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.